Good morning.
Good morning. I think we can go ahead and get started, Leanne.
Yep. I think we're ready. I assume everybody we need to have here is here.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess welcome back to this meeting for the purposes of reviewing the integrated science assessment for lead. First of all, I want to thank the panel for all your hard work yesterday. And to start out, I'd like to recap the items we need to revisit as well as summarize our next steps for today. So revisiting the topics from yesterday, I propose that we start with the revised draft table that was posted on the website this morning and sent to the panel members. Then I think we should discuss the advice we should provide regarding how to guide EPA to address multiple outcomes within an outcome category for causal determinations. I note for the record that I looked up the ISA preamble this morning and it's silent on how to do this for the causal determinations. So I think that as we'll get to, I think this is something that probably needs to be updated in the preamble and that we should be thinking thoughtfully about how to address it. I proposed some things yesterday, but I think we need to revisit that because it may not be the best advice. This also is linked to the pregnancy and birth outcomes row of the table, and was some of our discussion we had about the overarching comments throughout our discussion of all the appendices 3 through 10. And then for the health outcomes, the last topic I see is reconciling our advice about handling mortality outcomes as it appears in our comments for appendices 4 and 9. And then the last topic that I think we need to revisit from yesterday, which I propose that we actually turn to after we finish the consensus comments draft, is our advice regarding additional monitoring that relates to Appendix 1. So what I suggest is the order of topics for today is we'll finish reviewing our consensus comments for the health-related appendices having to do with those 3 items that I mentioned as well. And then we'll move on to Appendix 11 consensus comments and all the way through the end. And then we'll go back and revisit our comments for Appendix 1. It's my wish that we take a maximum of 2 hours for this consensus comments draft because we also have to get to the letter. And I think we need at least 2 hours for the letter. Hopefully that can go a lot faster because we will have agreed on a lot of these details. And then it's just making sure that the draft letter reflects them appropriately. So hopefully that'll be a lot more straightforward. Okay, so that's what I propose. Did I miss anything or does anyone have any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. I noticed there was, I think one of our panelists or our Charter CASAC members was able to join today that wasn't able to join yesterday. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself? Alexandra Panett-Gonzalez is a member of the Charter CASAC.
Sure. Hi, good morning. My name is Alexandra Panett-Gonzalez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning and also a curator of urban ecology at the Natural History Museum of Utah, both at the University of Utah. And happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so first, I want us to turn to that draft revised table. So Erin, do you want to post that to make sure everybody's looking at the right document? Okay, so what we've done with this is, first of all, the the text at the very top of the table was actually topic number, a slightly different version of topic number 10 in our right before the table, but we took off the number and separated it out, connected it so it's a little bit more clearly connected with the table. Then in terms of the headings, we changed CASAC recommendations to comments because that was a really important point, that these are not all recommendations. And then in each row, we made it clear whether we were making a recommendation or a suggestion. And then there was at least 1 or 2 rows that got deleted. So we agreed to recommend changing to causal on the cognitive function due to the strength of evidence and the renal effects. We had talked about suggesting including additional evidence to strengthen support. The next 2, immunosuppression and sensitization and allergic response, we're recommending just better justifications. I wanted to make sure that we are clear. This was the one I was maybe personally the least clear on exactly how to frame it with the pregnancy and birth outcomes. So the way it's worded now, and we can edit this, of course, if we need to, is to recommend revisiting the causal determination for possible upgrading once a more careful review of the next 2 outcomes is complete. The next 2 meaning the next 2 in the table. And we could make that clearer if people think it needs to be. And then consider additional separate groupings, and that should probably be outcome categories. Having looked now at the preamble, we should probably edit that to say outcome categories, because that's the wording that's used in the preamble for these outcomes, lumping the rest into an other category. And then for preterm birth and preeclampsia, based on the fact that Bruce gave a bunch of suggested references for EPA to review and they weren't incorporated in the ISA, we're recommending more careful review as opposed to suggesting that, because we did provide that feedback as part of the integrated review plan for both preterm birth and preeclampsia. And then we didn't so then female reproductive function, recommend changing to likely causal based on the age at menopause outcome. And then other organ systems and mortality. And again, we'll be revisiting this particular one with respect to Appendix 4 and 9 text, but consider combining with cardiovascular mortality in a new appendix. For total mortality. And then cancer, we didn't really talk about, but we just recommend correcting the conclusion to indicate a causal determination based on animal study evidence. So that's the proposed table right now. And by the time we're done our meeting today, we need to make sure that we have consensus on that. Susan.
So I just have one clarification, and I apologize, I kind of lost track. But for neurodegenerative disorders, the consensus was to remove it entirely, as opposed to comment that it's something that in the future EPA might want to look at, considering each disorder as an individual outcome.
Well, okay, and this is a judgment call, and we could certainly change it. I guess my thinking was that for future advice, it didn't need to be in the table.
Yeah.
And so that's why I took it out. But if the panel feels differently, we can certainly put it back in. It just seemed like these were the summary. This is the summary of things that we thought needed to be addressed in the revised ISA, which is different than a new review.
And I forget, is there a place in there for future advice? It's in your letter or not really?
Well, I think the wording, and we can go back and look at that particular section, the wording of our consensus comments, and the letter is a summary of the consensus comments. It's a distilled version of the consensus comments. So the place for making sure it is for future reviews, and I thought we agreed on that yesterday, so it should get in there, is actually in the consensus comments. And
Okay.
depending on the relative importance of it, it may or may not make it into the letter.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
And then I just had, I sent you some comments about revising the consensus language around how to manage specific outcomes within pregnancy and birth. And I think there is already in other categories. So I think the comments in the table will probably need to be edited a little bit based on our discussions of that topic.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, we'll make sure to do that, and we will come back to, well, we can actually come back to that now. So Susan's referring to the discussion we had yesterday about the multiple outcome categories, the multiple outcomes within an outcome category. And I had proposed yesterday sort of this blanket recommendation that wasn't well vetted yet, I think, to say the outcome with the strongest causal determination should drive the causal determination in the entire outcome category. And in a small group discussion after the meeting, Susan had some excellent points about how some of the outcomes really probably shouldn't drive the entire category, that they're just not important enough, is my interpretation of what you said, Susan. And so, but as I mentioned in my opening comments, the ISA preamble is silent on this, how, and we have pointed out in this review that it's not clear how EPA did it. So I think if people want to turn to the consensus comments, page 13, bullet number 5, which is on line 38. That this is the one we're talking about, and we can also clean up the language because to make it align it with the preamble. That will be important. In this bullet, but let's see. We have, through our conversation, we have suggested adding to the end of that. Did you want, Susan, since you were the one who proposed the edits, do you want to go ahead and lead this?
Sorry, can you just repeat where we are in the document again?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, particularly first thing in the morning. Page 13 of the consensus documents, consensus comments, number 5, which starts on line 38. Everybody with me now? Yeah, okay. And this is the bullet in our overarching comments about determination of causality. This is the bullet that basically says when there's multiple outcomes within an outcome category, like we don't know how EPA is deciding the causal determination, and so yesterday I was proposing we'll just have the outcome that is the strongest drive it, but that's probably not the best advice. So Susan, do you want to take over for a bit?
Sure. I think I obviously everybody should chime in, but I think one of the challenges here is that these causality determinations are trying to summarize information across multiple health outcomes, some of which are in some cases quite divergent in terms of biology and also in terms of likely public health significance. So figuring out, and I think that the for me anyway, the main problem with that is that there may be very important causal effects, which are essentially lost when the overall category is determined to be substantially less than causal. And so I think that's the challenge that coming up with a more systematic approach, I think it's trying to address. And so, I don't know what the right answer is, but it's pretty clear that right now there's not at least a transparent approach that EPA is using. And I appreciate that it's complicated. So, I think one of the things that Leanne had suggested and that we all talked about yesterday was if you have a health outcome category for which there's a couple of outcomes within it that are clearly causal, but the overall outcome category is given a, less than causal determination, maybe separate out those causal outcomes just so that they're not lost. And it's a little messier in terms of the taxonomy of the categorization for causality, but that's one approach. And then I sort of, in an email dialogue this morning, I also proposed an alternative, which I know Stephen said yesterday was logistically more work than it seems reasonable to ask the EPA to do, but within each overarching health outcome category, actually provide causality for each of the sub outcomes. And that way it's very transparent that there's diversity of outcomes and diversity of causal determinations within those outcomes. So, and I know that's a lot of work for the EPA, but on some level, I think for a lot of the outcome categories within an overarching category, it's pretty clear that there's not sufficient or adequate evidence to make them reach the level of causal or likely causal. There are only a few for which that's the case. So anyway, those are two ideas for how to manage this. I do feel like it's an important point and an important area that we can potentially advise the EPA regarding that will, strengthen their approach to the ISA causality determinations. But obviously this is something we should all talk about.
Yeah, this is super important. And I actually think one of the explicit things we need to add is that this, whatever they decide to do, and I like the idea of giving them a couple of options that we think make sense because we may not have thought through everything.
Yeah.
But I think we should recommend that an update to the ISA preamble be made that addresses this point. So I think that it needs to be incorporated into number 5, into our text about number 5.
Okay.
And then suggesting a couple of approaches and looking for others who might have thoughts on this. Mark, that would be helpful.
Yeah. I a couple thoughts. One, I agree. In general, I think it's a little odd to make a blanket recommendation or a blanket causality determination about this whole group when there are differences in biology there. From the perspective of the difficulties, though, it's been a while since I went over this chapter, but my recollection is, they're already sort of discussing all of the literature in there. And so the suggestion of Susan, which I think I like, which is to kind of pull out the ones that rise to causal or possibly even likely causal. Isn't that just more a matter of kind of rearranging their text because the discussion of the different things is in there? So you kind of pull out the ones that do appear to rise to a causal or likely causal level, and the rest you almost leave as it is. They've already got all of this stuff discussed in there. Is that not correct, Susan, in terms of kind of?
Well, it was my impression from Stephen's comments yesterday that they saw separating out individual looking at causal determinations for each individual outcome was a lot of extra work. I think he literally said that. So maybe I'm misremembering.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to then hear more on why that is, because it strikes me. It's all, we're going on the causality, thinking some of these are causal based on what's being described already.
Right.
So
that's correct.
To me, it's more a matter of just reorganization.
Yeah, and I'd like to hear from Steve Dutton, but maybe we'll ask Bruce to speak. Unless, Steve, do you want to go first or no?
Yeah, why don't you finish up and then we can respond.
Okay, so go ahead. So go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I like the idea too, and I think we should take some comfort in the fact that EPA, and I think we've made this recommendation, but we can make it again. We've suggested 2 ways that they can actually reduce their burden. Number one, don't go through a litany of all these studies that don't have ultimately an impact, that they're small, they're cross-sectional, they're not going to change things. And we've encouraged them not to give us that in the ISA, but rather to give us the more directly relevant studies. So we're trying to reduce their burden and make it easier for anybody reading the document. The second thing here is that I think, consistent with what Mark and Susan just said, there's no reason they couldn't say, okay, here's all of the pregnancy and reproductive outcomes. These are the two that rise to the surface that deserve more attention. We're not going to emphasize these others where there's less relevant evidence. And so in that way, again, we're not saying you have to do the thorough evaluation of every possible outcome under pregnancy and reproduction. It's the ones that float to the surface.
All right, thank you. Maybe Christina, before I call on you, I'll have Steve comment.
Sure, yeah, and I appreciate all the returning to this topic and discussing this in more detail. First, in regard to the preamble, I think I mentioned on our briefing to you all that we had, for those who were following the NASEM study that we sponsored that finished up last year, this was actually one of the questions that we posed to NASEM, and we didn't get clear advice there as well, but we are taking the advice that they gave and working that into a revised preamble. So any advice that you would like to share that we can think about as we're revising the preamble for the next review, which would be the oxides of nitrogen next review, would be incredibly timely. So definitely we welcome your input on potential revisions to the preamble. It's a tricky question. How fine do you make these causal determinations? And I think the reason we are silent on that in the preamble is because there is no clear answer to that question, but we're doing, and it can be kind of case by case. I think I'm going to ask Evan Kaufman if he'd like to elaborate some in particular on some of the discussions that went into determining how many categories we would put into this specific outcome. So Evan, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I just wanted to quickly touch on sort of these instances where we do have multiple lines of evidence within a sort of a larger health outcome category. And our approach in this ISA was to focus on those lines of evidence where there was the strongest evidence for the causality determinations. And so I think there's potentially an issue of the clarity and making that point a little bit more clear in our causality determinations, that the strongest lines of evidence, what the strongest lines of evidence are that are contributing to those causality determinations. In terms of the question about sort of the work that goes into breaking these into smaller subgroups for causality determinations, Dr. Weisskopf, you're certainly right that I think we have them organized already a little bit into these subsections. I think where it gets a little bit trickier is having to work through the specific causality determinations for each individual subgroup, whereas in our current approach, we can really focus the causality determination on those places where we do have the strongest evidence, and then sort of, as Dr. Lanphier mentioned, giving less weight and less attention to those endpoints where there's less evidence. But certainly, as Steve mentioned, I think that the feedback we get from you all is really helpful in shaping how we move forward on this issue.
And just a clarifying question to Steve, since I haven't been following the NASEM work as closely. So you specifically asked for advice on the multiple outcomes within a health outcome category?
Yeah, we asked. I don't know. I have to look back and see exactly how specific we were in our charge on that one. But that was one of the questions: is as you're establishing these causal statements, how fine do you go? How fine a resolution do you go in terms of the outcome categories?
Okay, thank you. Christina?
Thank you. So I just wanted to highlight for us to include in our discussion of the different options with regard to the causal determinations of considering what kind of impact that will make on what's considered for the policy assessment. I'm not clear if it's going to change what's considered for the policy assessment or not. So we can discuss that as well with these options.
Oh, gosh. I don't know if there's anybody at EPA, including anybody from OAR, that would want to weigh in and help us think about the answer to this.
Yeah, I think we do have at least one. Deirdre Murphy's on from OAR. Deirdre, do you want to take a crack at that? How you guys use the causal determinations?
Sure. It took me a while to find the right button. Sorry, I've just been listening. Good morning. So I'm the lead for OAQPS on the lead max review. And as you all are aware from our meeting back in June, next up on our plate for lead is working up the draft policy assessment. And if I understand completely the question, I mean, I feel like you all are giving us and ORD specifically good advice on a complicated topic, especially for this category, which, as you all have emphasized, is diverse in ways that other categories that we deal with are not, right? Like the prominent category of neurological effects, it doesn't quite have this issue of the diversity that you guys are recognizing here. In terms of the PA, we focus on characterizing or summarizing the characterizations that are in the ISA. The strength of the evidence is described in the ISA in terms of a conclusion that could be drawn, and those then become EPA's conclusions about what we find led to be a causal agent for. I think it's helpful in the PA to be as specific as we can. As you all know, we describe the PA as, I'm going to forget the phrase that we use, bridging the gap. We call it bridging the gap between the scientific and technical analyses and assessments of the ISA and what is needed for the administrator and decision makers in EPA on review. And so the more clear we can be about that, the better. And I find that helps when you're not talking about large categories. And as Steve and ORD have struggled with this over the years, going back and forth on how to do it. The 2013 ISA had slightly different distinctions in some of the large categories than they have today because they've learned a lot along the way. So we work with what they give us. One of my objectives is to try and make the policy assessment as clear and as accessible as it can be. And it helps when there's not like a lumping of things that don't so much fit together. So is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. We'll go on to Susan then, I think, Christina, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just have a follow-up because still being relatively new to the process and in previous other reviews of just having those that were causal or likely causal considered for the PA, if we were to have subcategories, if we're going to have a category now, then deemed causal, then those would be considered for the PA. Even if some of those subcategories, some may be suggestive or likely causal, and then wondering if we have categories, the subcategories now with their own designations, then we would have only those deemed causal at that subcategory level to be considered in the PA. I want to know if that would be the case. Does that question make sense?
So the policy assessment is simply conveying the agency's conclusions with regard to the evidence, and then which is the ISA embodies that, right? And then secondarily, as you all know, we do a variety of quantitative analyses, exposure and risk, and those tend to focus on aspects of the evidence for which we have a strength of conclusion and the right kind of information to do those analyses. And we just had the meeting in June where we talked about our plans for our quantitative exposure risk analyses, health for the primary standard of lead. And our focus, as you all know, is on neurocognitive effects, particularly in children. That has proven to be a sensitive effect for us. We have the tools to do those assessments, and it's a decision driving endpoint. It's one that is understood by policymakers and that at the agency we have focused on for many years now. So the PA brings everything forward. We're gonna, if you talk about pregnancy outcomes and identify 3 that are causal, we're gonna say that in the PA. If you say, if the ISA says that this category of, and I'm trying to look at my, okay, so if the category says we find that pregnancy and birth outcomes are causally related to lead, in the PA, I would try to put in more text to explain what that means, right? So I'm always going to go beyond a table line because I want the reader to understand what we mean by that. And it would say, particularly the evidence for this is strongly supportive of that if we did not draw a causal conclusion for one particular category. But if we did, I would say, causally associated with preeclampsia or preterm birth or whatever the more specific is. And frankly, I think that makes it a little easier to describe because then you're talking about something specific, but you guys have your own views. So is that helpful? I'm sorry, Dr. Fuller, I'm not sure if we're connecting or not.
Yes, that is helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Let's see if we can try to wrap this discussion up so we don't get too far behind. Susan, you had some more comments to make.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of backtracking a little bit from what Evan Kaufman said that, I think I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. Evan brings up yet another option for dealing with the multiple outcome categories. And that is that, you said that what's effectively happening is the causal determination is based on the strongest lines of evidence within a health category. And it wasn't clear to me reading this, which were considered the strongest lines of evidence and how those lines were defined to be consistent across different causal categories. So I think, developing a more systematic way to describe and identify what the EPA is considering the strongest lines of evidence for a given outcome category would be really helpful. I mean, the one that comes to mind is like male reproductive effects appeared to be largely driven by issues related to semen quality, but female reproductive health effects were driven by age of menopause or other important outcomes in the same way. And so the underlying logic and approach, if it were made more explicit, would be really helpful.
So, and our comments to some degree already address that point, I think.
Yeah, but I'm just saying it's a third option, which is that the EPA have language in each causal determination that explicitly, and maybe it's there, I just don't remember thinking of it this way, explicitly said, these are the main lines of evidence that are motivating our overall causal determination. And this is why we think these lines of evidence are critical based on their causality or their biological or public health importance or whatever. Like a more explicit description of what Evan says they do, I think would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you. And we should make sure that we make edits to that particular point that reflects that comment, I think. Bruce.
Yeah, just very quickly, I tried to do this in chat, but I couldn't. I wonder if Steve and Aaron, if they could just make sure we have the title or the executive summary of the NASEM report that Steve mentioned. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, we can make sure that we get access to that report. Okay, have we finished any additional comments on the table or on this discussion about how we want to advise EPA regarding multiple outcomes within an outcome category? Perry. You're muted.
Sorry. I'm in favor of the proposals on how to address the categories. I wanted to, and maybe we're going to get to this, wanted to go back to the breakout on the table for mortality, because I recognized in our comments, we didn't say anything about causality there. And I was going to suggest that we put that in as well so that it is reflective. Are we going to speak to that later?
I'm not sure. We were going to come back to the mortality with respect to the alignment with what we say in the cardiovascular, which is pretty much what's in the table. But we addressed that appendix at the very end of our meeting yesterday. So it's possible we skipped something important. So why don't we go to, what is that, Appendix 9? If there's something specific there that you wanted to address, I think this is a good time to do that, and then make sure that the table is appropriately updated. So Appendix 9 is in our consensus comments on page 25. It starts on line 4, the top of the page. And it goes on through the page 27. So would need a little help there. I think it's on page 26, line 40, talks about the causality determinations, and people can help me if there's whatever we need to say. So Perry, you're recommending a change to the causality or what?
Well, we're asking specifically in the table that they break down mortality, and I'm just suggesting that we also add that it be listed as causal.
Okay. And I'm not exactly sure what it was listed at. I say determination.
It was causal. Overall
Okay.
mortality was causal.
Okay, so what we probably do need to do is edit the table because it doesn't say that. So is that your suggestion actually? That
Yes.
Sorry, I was not following that exactly. Yeah, we will make sure to do that. Good comment. Thank you. Okay. So I think we're ready to move to the alignment of the text that's in Appendix 9 and with what was in Appendix 4. So this is on page 27, lines 25 to 30. And I'm wondering if I can look at Susan again, since you've done an awful lot of heavy lifting on all these appendices, and I really appreciate it. And I know we had a little bit of offline conversation about how to address this, and you thought we could just do it in our discussion today. So do you have a specific suggestion about any edits that we need to make to that text?
Well, I think one thing is just to remind everybody that for Appendix 9, there was an additional charge question separate from the charge questions for all the other health appendices about the appropriateness of having a separate category for all-cause non-accidental mortality, which hadn't been done in the previous ISA. And so I think that's the charge question that's supposedly being addressed. And cause-specific mortality analyses are embedded in the individual outcomes for which they apply, with the majority of cause-specific mortality being related to cardiovascular disease. So I think the first question is just, how do we want to phrase the notion of having a separate category for all-cause mortality? And then I guess both Appendix 4 and 9's comments include some commentary on the relative value of that versus cause-specific mortality measures and how those two should be related to each other. So, personally, I think it's useful to have a separate all-cause mortality category. And then the question is, should it be combined with other cause-specific mortality measures? Should it only be combined with cardiovascular disease mortality? Should it, I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I do think that the two appendices provide a slightly different take on that question, and coming up with consensus would be good. So.
Yeah, I guess just to jump in, I mean, I guess my sense of this too, that I also sort of favor a separate category for all-cause mortality. I mean, the issue with the cause-specific ones is that they, that literature in part informs that whatever that cause is. So when you're looking at causality determination for cardiovascular effects of lead, part of what contributes to that is cause-specific cardiovascular mortality. And so it makes sense to have it there as opposed to like a totally separate section on mortality that does each cause-specific one and then overall. But overall is sort of a different thing. So I guess that's why I lean towards a separate one for all cause, include cause-specific in whatever category, when you're discussing the rest of that causes literature.
So that suggests that our advice in the current draft table should be changed, because right now it says combining cardiovascular mortality in a new appendix. I assume the new appendix would be for for mortality. And so you're actually suggesting keeping it the way it is.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, keeping it the way it is in terms of the cause-specific mortality going with that health outcome category. And we're still talking about pulling out total mortality into its own appendix. Is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, we should come to consensus on this, but that is sort of where I'm leaning.
Okay.
Well, can I just jump in? I know, Bruce, you have your hand up. It's currently a separate category under other organ systems, right? It's not its own appendix. So I think, and EPA can clarify this, the question was just whether it should be a separate appendix or should be retained as a separate category because it wasn't in the previous ISA. And I think it sounds like we're in agreement. It should be a separate category. It's an important category. But I don't know, at what level it needs to be, if it needs to be an appendix or just a separate category as it currently is, seems good. And then and maybe you leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, I agree with the idea of having it as a separate category. The challenge, however, is that we don't really know what's captured, for example, with all-cause mortality. And just to give you an example, in our 2018 study with NHANES, we found about 250,000 deaths associated with cardiovascular disease and 400,000 associated with all-cause mortality. So it's a big deal to add on all causes. We emphasize the cardiovascular disease because we have clear mechanisms, because in 2013, the EPA said it's a causal risk, lead's a causal risk factor for cardiovascular disease. If we look at those 150,000 deaths, for example, in our paper, over and above cardiovascular disease mortality, I don't think EPA knows, is that from kidney disease? Is that from homicides? What's it from? And so I think that's the challenge. Even though I think we should include it as a separate category, I think that having it as a separate category will be much more important in the future when we have a better idea of what people are dying from over and above cardiovascular disease mortality. We can guess at it now. I don't know if we can quantify it right now.
Okay. Perry, are you continuing on this thread?
Yes, I was just going to support what Susan said, which we had the consensus to have a separate appendix that addressed both all cause and cardiovascular mortality. How we address, or how EPA should address the causal determination, I think is a second issue, but I just wanted to reiterate that I felt strongly that it should be discussed together in the document. Thanks.
Okay. All right, Mark.
Yeah. I guess just to follow up on Bruce, your point. I mean, I guess a couple things. I mean, one, I would think that, first of all, the sort of cardiovascular mortality would clearly also be captured in the cardiovascular section. I would assume in a mortality section for overall mortality, it would come out that, the major bulk of that would be cardiovascular. In terms of whether we know exactly what the rest of the stuff is, I guess I'm not as concerned about that. I mean, do we need to, if the literature clearly shows that there's an overall effect on overall mortality, right? And one of the points that got raised, I forget by whom, maybe it was Howard at the June meeting, was that one of the things about overall mortality is that you may pick up things that kind of synergize across systems that might not get identified when you look at an individual system because it's not quite strong enough or doesn't, rise to the level of being seen in the epi, but combined with everything else, you do see it. So I guess I'm a little less concerned that you don't know what those other deaths, what the sort of biology of the other deaths necessarily is, if the data does show that it is related to the overall mortality. And yeah, we'll figure that out. But I mean, and again, obviously a big chunk of that is going to be cardiovascular, and that would come out in the mortality section too. But I guess I'm a little less concerned that we don't specifically know what those other ones might be or the biology pathways in there.
Hey, Susan.
Yeah, just to clarify, Perry, I'm sorry, this is confusing, but I do think I agree with making an all-cause mortality category on its own. But I don't think we should combine it just with cardiovascular disease mortality. I agree with Mark that disease-specific mortality discussion should be in the disease-specific sections, and then an all-cause mortality separate section adds additional information. I appreciate, Bruce, like Mark said, that you don't know all of the reasons, but there is added benefit in having a sense of excess mortality, even if the specific causes are not enumerated, that provides additional public health information of value. So
Okay, so I'm hearing a couple of different things, and I see that what we have in the draft table is potentially needs to be changed. So right now, the effects on other organ systems of mortality, total non-accidental mortality, which is causal, we say consider combining with cardiovascular mortality in a new appendix. And I think I'm hearing at least what Susan just said, that we can keep the cardiovascular in the cardiovascular section, and whether we can maybe back off on a new appendix, but make it clear that it should be its own focus. I guess, so I guess those are a couple of questions I have. What are we recommending with respect to cardiovascular mortality? And are we specifically recommending a new appendix for total mortality, or is it okay to keep it where it is? So I'm not clear on that. I think I've heard a couple of different points of view.
well, I mean, I think that the specific charge question was worded, please comment on the current organization of this appendix, which is the appendix that it's in is the other organ systems, and the decision to incorporate a separate causality determination for exposure to lead and total non-accidental mortality. So I think having a separate causality determination for total non-accidental mortality is great, and they should keep it. And I like the way they've done that, which doesn't necessarily get into whether it should be its own appendix or not. Just that it has separate causal determination, I think is important.
Yeah, and maybe we drop telling them how many appendices seems like maybe that's beyond what we need to do also. Perry.
Well, I would just point out that we don't have a causality determination for cardiovascular mortality, just for cardiovascular is my understanding, because it's not separated out now.
Ask that again. I'm sorry, Perry, I didn't follow.
Wait, was it separated out before?
Isn't there a cardiovascular mortality section within cardiovascular effects?
I think his point is that the causal determination is for the whole broad combined category.
Got it.
Not separate for that specific outcome.
Got it.
that.
And therefore, I was proposing that, and I thought we had consensus in June that it be a separate appendix on mortality, and then it would break out all cause and cardiovascular.
But just, you're saying just cardiovascular, not like every other mortality cause, just specifically focusing on all cause. I mean, excuse me, cardiovascular in addition to all cause is what you're
Correct.
saying.
Correct.
Okay. Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing the discussion and basing on what's been done in other pollutant reviews, and thinking about the consideration of causality. I think it's very important to keep cardiovascular mortality, the consideration of that, keep it within cardiovascular, because that helps to determine the cardiovascular, if you have a clear signal of cardiovascular mortality, then that informs the causality of cardiovascular disease, especially if you have consistency with morbidity endpoints in cardiovascular disease. So it really does need, I think, to be considered in the cardiovascular disease section. But I agree we need a separate consideration for all cause or non-accidental mortality, which is driven by cardiovascular mortality. So I think it should be kept in the cardiovascular section, but should be considered in the total mortality section, which should be separate and have its own causality determination, which it does now, right? So that's basically what Susan was saying, and I support that idea. I'm not, I don't hang my hat on whether it's an appendix or whether it stays where it is.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, sorry, not to muddle things, but to go back to Perry's point, I mean, it's a good point, and I want to make a clarification to see what people think, because in the cardiovascular section, clearly the literature would be discussed, and the effects on cardiovascular mortality would contribute to the causality determination of overall cardiovascular effects. But I do see, I think, Perry, what you're getting at, and I do see a rationale for this, is that is there a reason to have a separate causality determination specifically for cardiovascular mortality, which presumably would not happen in the cardiovascular section, because there you're just doing it for overall cardiovascular effects, right? So I think that, I guess, Perry, that's what you're getting at. And so maybe, are you suggesting, and I guess maybe I would agree or could be convinced to agree, that in the mortality section, you can make an overall causality determination for overall total non-accidental mortality, but also potentially for subcategories where there's sufficient evidence, which cardiovascular would be one of. And because I do see that without that, you don't actually get a very specific causality determination for cause-specific mortalities, because in the cardiovascular section, it just is lumped in with everything else. Is that, I think that's what I'm reading you saying, Perry, and I guess I sort of agree. If I think the discussion point is it needed to have a specific causality determination for a specific cause of death, as opposed to the overall mortality?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, Mark. And I think this is really key decision, because this is one of the outcomes that was not evaluated 10 years ago. The data wasn't there 10 years ago. The studies weren't there, and we have those now. And I think it's crucial that we're not just talking about a disease. Now we're talking about mortality. And we can't say that with many toxicants.
So what I'm hearing, and I think this may be a way forward, is we continue and probably, I mean, maybe a separate appendix is logistically more sensible when we're saying keep a separate causality determination for non-accidental, and then on top of that, add any categories of mortality where there is sufficient causal determination for any categories of mortality where there is sufficient evidence, in this case, specifically cardiovascular mortality. So that's what I'm hearing. And do we have consensus on that? Is there anybody who disagrees? And I think that, sorry, it was a little convoluted. It sounds like that's more or less what we came to before. and we just took us a little while to get there again. Mark. anything you want to add on that?
Well, I would just say I do disagree. I don't think it's, I think it unnecessarily adds a category. I don't see that it's going to impact how things are, the advice to the administrator in the end of things. I think if we consider, I don't think it's necessary to break out subcategories of total mortality as long as they are adequately considered and the evidence is discussed within the organ system involved. I think it's obvious that if we think the evidence for mortality within another organ system like cardiovascular is sufficient to be causal, that's going to be captured under that organ system. And part of what drives the causality determination should be the other evidence of morbidity. So I would disagree with that. It's kind of, lumping versus splitting. I don't feel strongly about it, and I certainly would go with the majority consideration here.
Okay, Bruce.
Well, I think I would tend to still split, but I think it's less important today. In the future, I think it's going to be important to try to understand the different causes of death that come underneath this umbrella of total mortality. So let's say in 5 years, when the next group is sitting here, we have more evidence that of the 400 or 350,000 people that die every year in the United States, 200,000 from cardiovascular disease, 75,000 is from kidney disease, another 10,000 are from something else. I think at that point, it becomes much more important to have this separate category. And so I think setting the stage for that's important.
Okay, so I think we need to move on. I'm hoping we have enough to word this, and who's the lead on editing this? Mark is. Okay, do you feel like you have what you need to take in all these multiple points of view and give some reasonable advice based on this conversation?
Well, I guess I'm still a little uncertain now, given Mark's comment about whether we want to propose a separate causality determination for cardiovascular mortality.
I mean, one option would just be to use soft language and say, consider the possibility of splitting out total mortality subcategories within that appendix. I'd be fine with that.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing we could do is incorporate Bruce's point that he just made, that this may become more important in the future as a way, but with the soft language and the future looking perspective, then we're not really dictating that it be changed right now, but we're giving that guidance. Susan.
Yeah, just to throw a wrench in it a little bit, the Appendix 4, which Brisa did a really nice job with, also comments on this. So I think Brisa can potentially, work with Mark to make sure that they're not discordant in their recommendations.
Okay. Perry.
Okay, I guess there's a mixed view on the breaking it apart in the appendix, but I didn't hear a strong consensus about causality determination for cardiovascular mortality, which I think should be in there as part of that table that we looked at a few moments ago.
Okay, yeah, so you would like us in the table to say, add a separate causal determination for cardiovascular mortality.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's very important.
Okay. Does anybody disagree with that? I think Mark was disagreeing with that, right?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
But was that, just to clarify, was that disagreement based on considering the literature and worrying about whether cardiovascular mortality would rise to causal, or just the idea
No.
of period?
I'm no, my objection is that I don't see I think it just confuses things at this stage to set out on our own and put it in the table, since I think this is something we should leave the option to EPA whether they want to split it out or not, and put it in soft language that they consider doing this. But to put it in the table, that suggests this is something that we recommend, that's why I don't disagree that the evidence says it's causal.
Yeah,
It doesn't say that anywhere though in the summary table. So I think it's, if you agree that it's causal, I think it should say it.
I mean, it is true. I mean, what I guess what's the harm of saying it in the table if we believe if it's causal?
So what are we saying about total mortality? I mean, actually, I'm looking at the table, the ISA determination, it doesn't say what it is here in the table. It just, under a determination, it says total non-accidental mortality. It doesn't say what the determination is.
I think we determined causal in the document.
Yeah, and that'll be edited.
So I'm just saying that's sufficient. We already have a causality for total mortality. That's, and the discussion in the ISA should talk about what specific subcategories contribute to that. And obviously total mortality in this country is driven by cardiovascular mortality. So that's going to be in the discussion of that. And it's going to be under cardiovascular, which is also causal, right?
No, Mark, that's not how it's organized currently. Currently, it's separated out. So the causal is for the total non-accidental. It doesn't address cardiovascular in that section.
No, I understand that. But I'm saying it's going to be clear from the discussion in the two sections that cardiovascular mortality is a driving factor for the total mortality. The important outcome is total mortality, and that's already causal. I'm just saying I don't see a benefit or a change in breaking it out as a subcategory under mortality, because it should be, and to me, it's more appropriately considered as driving the cardiovascular causality. And if both total mortality and cardiovascular disease we have determined as causal, then it doesn't matter whether you have a subcategory of cardiovascular mortality in the mortality piece of it. Both of them are causal, and that sends the message of what's happening with lead.
Well, if you consider that, mortality is the greatest cause of death, I think if you're trying to talk to a policy person, it's pretty important to outline what contributes to that. And it gets lost if it's a subcategory within other effects of lead.
We do need to move on, but maybe
I don't feel terribly strongly about this, and I will yield to the opinion. It's just not, like you say, not worth spending a whole lot of time on.
Yeah, and partly maybe Mark's concern, you can be alleviated as long as we make it clear that cardiovascular mortality should be continued to be addressed in the cardiovascular section, and it could be called out as well in the total mortality section. Maybe that's the way to address that. That's the way of address it, as opposed to moved. I mean, if it was moved out of the cardiovascular section, I think everybody would agree with you that that would be problematic because of the reasons that you articulated. So keeping it in the cardiovascular section makes a lot of sense, but also calling out that it's the leading cause of total non-accidental mortality is probably valuable. Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to say what you just said. I mean, it can be both places. I think that's fine.
Okay, Mark.
Yeah, just for my sake in writing it up, I mean, is there, is it okay to have language that says that there was, not complete consensus on whether to specifically point to causality of cardiovascular mortality?
Yeah, I think that's fine. And when it's mostly one person, which sometimes we go to, but I don't know how important it is. And I think that the key point as we're getting to it is making sure that it doesn't get removed from the cardiovascular section, and then how much attention it gets in the total mortality section is I think, Perry feels very strongly, as I'm hearing, that it needs a separate causal determination. And Marx thinks it's less important, but maybe he'd be more appeased as long as he knows that it's not taking away from the weight of evidence for the total cardiovascular determination.
And just because I haven't looked this over recently and I'm sort of forgetting, I want to just make one other thing, make sure I'm clear on one other thing, because the appendix had, other organ systems and total non-accidental mortality. I forget, I think I must have commented on this before, but we're separating out mortality from the other organ systems. Is that what we're saying with the separate appendix?
Well, I think we didn't get complete clarity on how much we want to micromanage it being a separate appendix. I think we should remove the separate appendix from the table, keep the advice that it should remain a separate causal determination, and maybe soften whether it goes in a separate appendix. That's probably
right, but definitely not lumped into the cardiovascular, that it's a separate thing from that. Is what
Okay, can we move on from this? I think we finished the health now. Anybody have anything else with health? Okay, so we're going to move on to Appendix 11. This is starts on page 28, line 26. It's kind of long, so we'll start maybe with just page 28, if any, and 29. How about that? And people need to switch gears. I have one note on page 29, line 3 to 4 is this point must be stressed in later Appendix 11 sections. The point was difficulty of attributing observed effects in the field to lead. And I wasn't clear. Did we just mean presumably this is just subsections of Appendix 11. I guess it was just exactly what we meant by Appendix 11 sections. I was a little bit unclear about, but maybe that's a minor point that we can deal with offline.
Yeah, there are a couple of editorial clarification points that I didn't provide you, but I want to make as we go through some of these.
Okay, so maybe that's in that category and you can just help us straighten that out.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm just moving forward, page 30. Anything coming up on page 30? How about page 31? So I had something flagged on page 31 on line 19 through 22. It says, finally, section IS 8 provides a good discussion of the types of endpoints that should be considered and the importance of having sound linkages between observed effects and lower levels of biological complexity and effects in population community levels of complexity. And my question was, do we recommend any changes in Appendix 11 pertinent to this comment?
Hadn't thought about that one.
And it sort of, it talks about the integrated summary almost as though it wasn't covered in Appendix 11 is kind of the way I read that, why I had a question about that sentence.
Yeah, and I need to go back and check and chase down IS-8, but it's kind of like everyone else. I haven't looked at this in a bit, and I have to go back and chase down specifically the point on that. We can label that, and I can come back to it if that works for you.
It probably does. I don't think it doesn't sound, it sounds like whatever the text is maybe needs to also be in Appendix 11 or not, or just this needs to be reworded. And I think if that sounds minor enough to me that we don't need to vet that in public.
Yeah.
I wonder if this sentence is just not out of place, that it doesn't need to be in this part of the document, but rather in the part that considers section, the integrated summary.
Yeah, I understand exactly. I mean, what the point was that was being made. I mean, welfare effect measurements meaningful, valid, and reliable. The question is, if you see something in the field, can you actually interpret it? And that's not caught necessarily in the meaningful, valid. I mean, I guess it could be under meaningful. You could include interpretable under meaningful. And to that end, I think that we can just make an editorial change to that. I think Chris and I can work together and come up with something that would satisfy.
Okay.
Chris, you okay with that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm moving on to page 32. I had another thing that I flagged. Was on the top of the page, the sentence that starts on line 2, where it says, we find the causality determination for neurobehavioral effects on aquatic invertebrates could be upgraded to causal. Now, could means EPA, it's at EPA's discretion, whereas should would mean we think it should be. And my question is should we keep the word could or should we change it to should? And that's just to be intentional about our advice.
Yeah, this originated as a comment that I made, and it was largely based on reading of the ISA and not any further understanding of the deeper literature. I read the ISA text and couldn't understand, based on the strength of what they had written, why it wasn't a causal interpretation. So I would leave this as could, so because I think it is ultimately, I don't have anything to add to what they describe.
Okay, thank you. I think
yeah.
that's sufficient then, if that's what you think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, looking back at the Hills Association criteria, they just need to go back and look to make sure that it satisfies everything appropriately.
Okay, good. Thank you. I also had a question about lines 13 to 14. So that, well, the sentence, I guess, starts on line 12. But the part I flagged was, are themselves low enough to possibly warrant consideration in the development of a secondary standard? And I just wasn't exactly sure what we were saying. And so maybe this is just a wordsmithing detail. I don't know that there's anything, whether there's anything we need to air in public with respect to this sentence.
I agree. It again, that's one of the editorial things that I had kind of highlighted, and just want to go through and clean those up.
Okay. Is there anything you want to say about our intent?
I know what I mean there, and I think that I can state it in a clearer manner. I mean, basically, what we're doing is taking the worst case conditions, where lead would be at its greatest toxicity, and asking EPA to see whether that warrants a secondary standard. Which I guess until we do those calculations, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, because I think that clarifying our advice will be important because that flows into the policy assessment.
Got it.
And I also had a clarifying question about line 30. There is sufficient new information to modify some of the 2013 causality determinations that were judged inadequate at the time to suggestive or causal based on current data. So from the text, I can't determine which one should be upgraded. So I think that's probably something we should say, not just generically. There's some that could be addressed, but if we're giving advice to upgrade causal conclusions, I think we need to be specific.
I could be wrong, but I think that that's simply an observation that based on the EPA's analysis, they upgraded some of the causality determinations, and that we were happy to see that. I don't think that was meant as a suggestion that any of them be changed. Am I right, Bill?
I think so. Although in the back of my mind, there's part of me, Chris, that remembers thinking about that and looking at it and going, there's enough information now that other jurisdictions are able to develop criteria and things of that nature, which would suggest that there is a causal relationship. I mean, if you can run an ELS test and you see survival and growth effects, then that's pretty clear indication in a single species test. So I think that is what was in mind. But point well taken, Leanne, and I can go back through and specifically look at that. But I mean, that was what the thinking was. If you can come up with a marine criteria, I would think that there's a relationship between exposure and dead critters or not growing critters, things of that nature.
Okay, so I just want to make it really clear, and we'll take a bit of a break in a little bit. So I know there's not going to be much time, but if we're recommending any changes to the causality determinations they made, we need to get that vetted in public. So we can't do, that's not an editorial change we can do offline. If this wording is just saying that we like what they did and they gave, we appreciate that they've upgraded some things, then that's a wordsmithing thing that we can do offline. But if we're asking for other things that should be upgraded, we need to say that today.
Right.
We're going to lose our chance. So put that, I mean, I know you guys are in the middle of this right now, but maybe when we're talking about some things where your expertise is less in demand, you can look at that and we can circle back to that.
Sure.
At which we need to do today, because that is something that has to be done in public.
I think I just need to go back and look at the causality table under the marine effects and call that out. I mean, the following sentence about Church et al., that was the point that I was trying to make. But I will, I think your point's well taken. We can do that.
Yeah, okay, so just so you know, on the ISA, that's PDF page 117 is where
Thank you.
those detailed recommendations are. That's IS-14 table. So that's where you would look. I don't have any other comments about Appendix 11. Is there anyone else that has any comments? So we've agreed that there's some wordsmithing that's going to happen offline about a few things I identified and probably a few others that shouldn't change the meaning of what's said here. And then in addition, we're going to circle back about whether we're recommending any changes to the causal conclusions before we wrap up today. So I think we're ready to move on to Appendix 12, which is the process for developing the integrated science assessment for lead. So that starts on page 33, line 29. And let's just go down to page 34, line 28. That's just the first charge question about the clarity that it communicates the process. And see if anybody has any proposed edits or comments. Oh, Bruce, thank you.
Yeah, and this is, I don't know if you're asking for a specific, to evaluate a specific point, but I did want to look at on page 34, line 22 and 23. In table 12.5, it says, it should be clarified that race is an indicator of social factors, not biological factors, as noted elsewhere in the text. And my understanding is that race actually can be an indicator of social and biological factors. For lead, for example, we can see that people of African descent have greater capacity for calcium, excuse me, calcium absorption, which should be a wonderful thing, right? Lower fracture rate, higher bone mineral density, lower rates of osteoporosis, all of those are good things. Unfortunately, if you live in a lead contaminated environment, you're more likely to have a higher blood lead level, given vitamin D receptor FOC1. So it's actually can be both. I don't know that it needs to be changed, but and unless I'm misreading that, I just think it's something that we need to be thoughtful about.
Well, it sounds like we should do a little editing of that to reflect that comment. And I'm not hearing any concerns about it, so we'll see if we can do that. Susan, were you going to say
Yeah,
something?
I mean, I was just gonna say, I mean, that you bring up a really good point, Bruce, but I think one of the challenges is the race has historically been used as a biological construct in all sorts of settings. And for the majority of issues, it's not. And so I think it's just really important that that be clear. That, most of the time, race is really a proxy for psychosocial experiences that are race related but have nothing to do with biology. And I think it's important to make sure that that priority is clear.
Yeah, I think that's easy enough to do, Susan. I think one could easily say that while race is primarily, we're primarily concerned about race because of social factors and exposures, that there may be other factors such as calcium absorption, for example. But we can emphasize the point that you made without dismissing some evidence that there may be some biological factors. Is that sufficient for you?
Yeah, I think the devil's in the details, but yeah, I mean, you just need to think about how you word it so that it's appropriate. Yeah.
Thank you. George has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, would it be sufficient to say something like that race is primarily an indicator of social factors, not usually biological factors, just some modifiers in there?
That works for me, George.
Good. That's a
Right.
simple edit.
Yep.
Thank you.
Just add 2 words.
Thank you. And we don't need to go into those details, but people listening have benefited from that conversation. I think we'll keep going forward to the executive summary. We're on line 31, page 34, up through, oh gosh, it goes all the way through page 36, line 20. And there were several comments that I have marked here. I see Susan provided, I have 2 places where Susan provided comments on page 35. Do you want me to help you? Bruce, go ahead.
Well, I think I had some comments on one of the points that Susan brought up, and I if I recall when I read it, I agree, and that is the idea of persistence. To me, I look at the literature, and there's no question that the effects of lead persist. You can see ongoing cognitive deficits, at least across 3 studies that go into follow children into adulthood. So I think the evidence is quite clear. I don't know why anybody needs to waffle about evidence on persistence.
Okay, and so that was page 35, line 28 to 29. Okay. That's where I think that comment is about persistence into adulthood.
Well, I mean, I think that some of it's a terminology thing, irreversible versus persistent. I mean, it's sort of saying that it's not clear from the literature that these effects are irreversible. And I just wasn't sure what that meant, because as Bruce said, and I said in my comments, there is evidence of persistence. So what does it mean by, I mean, there are also, with intervening environmental enrichment, you can oftentimes no longer detect lead-associated decrements in earlier life. But the notion of irreversible, I mean, I guess I'm just not sure what's meant by saying the literature doesn't, what's meant by irreversibility versus persistence.
But isn't that maybe the point? That because there's a quote from the ISA right before that. Isn't that the point of this sentence?
Well, the quote says the cognitive effects may be irreversible, and then it's saying maybe they persist, but they're not irreversible. I mean, I guess.
I remember having a discussion about this and feeling like, persistence means that I think there is evidence that these things can persist into adulthood, right? What there is less evidence about, I think, in humans is specifically whether you can reverse the biological damage of the lead. I mean, that's very hard to specifically tease out. Is that the distinction?
Well, that's an issue of whether it's reversible versus irreversible, right?
Right. Well, so that making the claim that it's irreversible, I'm saying I don't know that that's been tested directly. It certainly persists, but could you reverse the damage? I don't know. I don't know that study has been done for that.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. I'm not aware of any study that shows, other than 2 rat studies that say if you put rats in a stimulating environment, they do better. But that's in advance of the exposure, not after the exposure. So I suppose you could say this is true. We just don't know because nobody studied whether you can reverse or ameliorate lead toxicity. I think the problem is it sounds convoluted the way it's written.
Okay, so we'll wordsmith it to clarify that there is evidence of persistence, but not studies showing evidence of reversibility, right? Okay.
Yeah,
good.
I think if you put the not studies, that would help. Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's helpful. Thank you. There was another comment from Susan about the paragraph that starts on line 34. Saying you found the original executive summary text on the topic unclear.
Yeah, I mean, the rationale for the increasing slopes over time, lead air slopes over time, I couldn't understand what they were saying. And it seemed, the ES seemed to be saying that because there's more as air sources declined, or the relative contribution of air sources changes, that would contribute to an increasingly steep slope, which just doesn't make sense to me, because that sounds like it's a measurement error issue, which in theory shouldn't result in a systematic bias in the relationship. So I just found the explanation really convoluted and hard to follow.
You mean our explanation here, or the one in the
one in the ES? And I think that that's something that that needs to be clarified in our analysis.
Okay, and I think it sounds to me like we had a bit of a conversation of this yesterday too, that it may pertain to this point. Brian, are you going to help us navigate this?
Unfortunately, no. I would like to go back to that word reversible and suggest we do not use it. I mean, think about what lead does to child central nervous system cellular architecture. The idea that that's recovering and going back to what it would have been without lead is implausible to me. We're talking about, sort of secondary and tertiary prevention. We're talking about kind of rehabilitation interventions to recover some function, but the effect is still there. And I don't think we should use the term reversible at all.
Okay, so the quoted text uses it. So maybe you're suggesting that part of our advice is that EPA remove reference to reversibility, not just that we don't talk about it.
If they want us to use this term reversibility, please.
So I mean, I think this is tricky because it's also not clarifying like what kind of outcome we're talking about. I would say if you look in a dish and you put lead in a dish and ask how one cell connects to another via synaptic transmission, and then take lead out of that dish, that can reverse because the lead blocks a receptor and doesn't allow as much transmitter to go through or calcium to go through. And if you flush out the lead, that comes out and it will reverse. If a synaptic architecture or cellular connection or a cell is killed by lead, then yeah, that's not going to reverse. So, and probably more of the effects we're talking about on these long-term cognitive effects are more related to the latter than the former. So I agree with that, but I guess this is where it gets into, I mean, so yeah, I mean, there's, yeah, it may be better to avoid the word just to not get into all of that detail.
But also maybe, I mean, we're quoting a sentence that has the word irreversible in it. So maybe part of our advice is that each EPA should be cautious about using that terminology.
Or certainly, that some or even many of the effects are likely to be irreversible. I mean, if you're killing cells or you are doing it during a development period and you simply establish a section of the brain aberrantly, that is very unlikely to reverse. But
some of the functional effects can improve over time, but the architectural effects probably are not going back to what they would have been in the absence of lead exposure.
Yeah. So, but I think that was another issue I was trying to get at. Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about that underlying brain biology, or are we talking about functionally, can you sort of recover some, there's a lot of recovery of other systems in, after stroke, for example, where you clearly have had an irreversible effect of the stroke, but you can recover a lot of function based on changing where in the brain it's done. But so what do we mean by reversible? So it might be that we want to avoid this to not get into all that detail.
Don't use the word or have more nuance about what we're saying recovers.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should advise EPA, not just ourselves, since we're quoting a section that uses that word.
Yes. That's right. And I think either we use recovery, evidence of no studies have looked at recovery, no studies have looked at amelioration, but I agree the idea of irreversibility is problematic. So either it needs to have more nuance, that you need to use a different word, and we should give them that advice. I actually had a problem with the same one beginning on line 34. I've thought about this for a long time, and this paragraph about slope factors and changes in air lead level made no sense to me. And I don't know if it just confused me or if I disagree with it. I mean, the only thing I can say is that as you remove lead in general, not just from lead in air, but in general, you're going to have lower blood lead levels. And given the shape of the dose response relationship, you're going to see a steeper effect. But that's not what this paragraph is saying. And at higher blood lead levels, you tend to have more confounding, which may be in part why you see a flattening of the dose response relationship. But that's not what this paragraph is saying. I don't know what the paragraph is saying. I can't understand it. But to the extent I think I may understand it, I disagree with it.
Can I ask a clarification point?
Yeah.
So understand, when they're talking here about slope factor, are they talking about a health outcome, or are they talking about the air lead blood lead relation?
Oh,
it's the air blood lead relationship. It's not a health outcome, Bruce. So I think that's the confusing part. But it's still totally
it's still problematic. I still have a trouble with it. But
I agree. I have it's the same problem, but I was absolutely talking about health effects, but it's the same issue regardless. I don't even know if it's important. I would just recommend they just delete the paragraph, because it's sort of like some hypothetical speculation, but it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. It's unnecessary and it's confusing, and it may be wrong.
Well, there you have it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, if you read, the sentences after the quote, in fact, suggests that the EPA consider deleting this. It asks the question: would it substantively change how the evidence is viewed? My reading of the original paragraph was that what they were doing is trying to justify the use of studies that were done during the period of leaded gasoline, in continuing to frame the background for the creation of the standard. And I think that my comment was simply, that we should be living in the here and now, and we should be analyzing the here and now, and that's what's in this paragraph. So I don't know that we need to change anything in the document that we're presenting here, except for perhaps a maybe stronger admonition to consider removing that entirely.
Okay, thank you. So just strengthen our point about what's removed. Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Chris, I think if it's the case that slope factors are steeper now, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that that needs to be taken into account in current estimates of the contribution of air to blood. And that the reason they're steeper is unclear, but I think trying to speculate about that is the problem. So I think acknowledging that the empiric evidence suggests steeper slopes now, and that's the evidence that should be used to estimate air blood relationships going forward is the most important point, right? Because that's what you're saying. But I think acknowledging that this is empiric observation is there, but I think it's a mistake to try to explain it, because I think the explanation is incredibly hard to understand.
All right, thank you. Kathy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Susan said. It is hard to understand. One of the things that's very clear, though, is the difference when you have lower concentrations in the air, you have, and lower exposure, you have more efficient uptake to red blood cells. And that's just a biological reason for this, air blood lead relationship being, more captured at lower levels of exposure.
Okay, thank you. Mark.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate what Kathy said, number one. I think that is the most important feature here. And I actually would frankly say that those first two sentences are frankly wrong. You will not get a higher dose, slope factor when you go down because there are other sources in the environment. You're looking at air lead to blood. If there are other sources, that's not going to create a higher slope. I think they're frankly wrong.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say too.
Okay, so you're saying that the sentences, although that starts on line 36 and is quoted there, those are the quoted from the ISA. You're saying those are wrong.
Yeah, the although slope factor sentence and the following one, I just do not agree with. I think that is wrong.
Okay. All right. So we need to say that directly. So we need to edit this.
And I would change it to what Kathy said. I think what Kathy said is the more relevant thing.
Okay. All right. All right. And who's the lead on this? Is that George?
Yeah, that would be me.
Are you on top of all this?
Good. Yeah, I can try to synthesize it if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I am. Okay, thank you. So anything else on the executive summary section of this consensus response? That goes all the way through to page 36, line 20. Bruce.
Yes, on the next page, page 36, my PDF is freezing on me. The first paragraph, it talks about whether we need to use a nonlinear dose response relationship cognitive abilities, and you can use either. But if I think what somebody said a moment ago, if we're looking at the here and now, and 95%, 97%, 98 or 99% of kids, for example, have blood lead levels under 5, you can use a linear relationship, because at that range of exposure, it is a linear dose response relationship. It's only when you look at a greater range of exposure that you see the nonlinearity. And since it might be easier to use a linear relationship, you could certainly choose to do that.
Okay, so we should clarify that part of this is only relevant if you're considering a large range. All right, anything else on the executive summary? Right, I think we're moving on to the integrated synthesis, line 23, page 36, 36, excuse me.
Sorry, Leanne, I just, one more thing is I don't know whether this was covered in what Bruce was just talking about in that section there.
Sure.
Where we say, so this is page 36, line 6. There's the last sentence, and I can't remember whether Bruce's comment has chopped this or not, but the last sentence of or is it possible that the apparent nonlinearity is an artifact of less precise measurements of blood lead at lower levels? So first, I agree with Bruce that if you're at lower levels, you can just use linear, but this I don't think is correct at all. It's sort of Susan's point. I mean, if it's less precise measurements, that's not going to create a steeper relation down there. So that's not creating the nonlinearity. So that sentence doesn't seem correct to me.
All right, how about we just strike it?
Sure.
I agree.
Okay, good.
I agree.
That's an easy fix. That's the kind of fix that we need to be coming to, or we're going to run out of time. All right, now we're on to the integrated synthesis, I think. Page 36, line 23. It's kind of long, but it goes all the way to the end of the consensus comments on page 38. I see Susan had a couple of comments, is what I have in my notes. Anything anybody wants to bring up? George.
I just note that lines 41 to 44 kind of reflects back to the discussion maybe an hour ago about how to group total mortality, and here EPA themselves seem to be a little confused how to structure it. That's the table IS1 versus figure ES2. So I just thought I'd point that out because that was an earlier discussion.
So is there anything we should do to change this
No.
to reflect that discussion?
Well, we could add, if we, whatever consensus we came to about how it should be categorized, pick one, so to speak, of these two options. And then we could recommend how they resolve it. But the overall structure is that total, as it currently stands, that total mortality is included under effects on other organ systems. That's consistent with the organization of the ISA on page IS7. So it's really only figure ES2 that lists it as a major separate category.
I agree. This is why I was saying earlier that this whole issue of mortality is totally lost in this report if we're trying to communicate to non-scientists and policy people.
But so the question here is, do we have a preference for how they do it, given the two ways that they have it done?
And it sounds like from what Perry was saying that we want to recommend that that mortality is called out separately, right? That's
Okay,
what I heard Perry say.
So that would be consistent with figure ES2 as opposed to IS1. Be a major separate category, still under the effects of other organ systems, but called out as a separate category.
Okay.
Well, wait, isn't it going to be broken out now? Wasn't that the consensus, or that mortality was going to be broken out from other?
Yeah, I think we never explicitly told EPA we decided to leave it to their judgment about whether it's in a separate appendix or not, but it's clear, and it's already clearly broken out in the appendix it's in. And we are going to also suggest they add cardiovascular mortality as a separate causal determination as part of the mortality. But I think what I'm hearing here with these summary tables is that separate mortality consideration isn't called out as clearly and consistently, and we think it should be. So the question of whether it's in a separate appendix, I think we decided was something we can leave to EPA to really decide, but addressing it separately is what we agreed on. That's what I heard.
Yeah, and actually I misspoke. The ES2 listed as a major separate category, separate, but after effects on other organ systems. So that's where they do list it as its own independent category. I misspoke a few minutes ago. So it sounds like that's what we're looking for.
I think based on Perry's advice in particular, we need to make sure that mortality is addressed separate as a cause of consideration.
So that would be consistent with figure ES2 as opposed to the rest of the organization. So that's something we can explicitly request, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's see if we can finish this and then we'll take a break and then we'll circle back to the rest of the details on the consensus comments. Susan.
Yeah, just briefly, the comments that I offered. I mean, this is easy to check. I didn't realize that the internalizing behavior causality determination had changed since 2013. So I guess that's easy to check.
Okay.
But the one thing I thought was worth talking about is there's a set on page 38, lines 17 to 21. So I think this notion that later childhood exposures are not relevant, I think is a problem, and that we probably need to have a little more commentary about it. And I made some the role of later childhood exposures is relevant, and in studies that adjust for earlier exposures, there shouldn't be confounding. So I think this was a sort of a problematic, to me, a very problematic comment from the IS that basically all that really mattered were prenatal that later childhood exposures independent of prenatal were not relevant. I just think that's wrong. And maybe we need to elaborate on our comments on this a little better. Because even if early life is considered the more critical exposure period, that doesn't justify them being determined as irrelevant. They're still relevant.
I think Susan is volunteering to write some text.
Well, I offered some text. George, I can share with you. I don't know if others want to chime in about how they feel about the role of exposures across childhood, but I think they're all important.
Bruce is going to help us with this.
Yes, I agree with Susan, and it's not definitive, but if you had to pick a sensitive time period for cognitive outcomes, not for preterm birth, of course, early childhoods may be more important than prenatal exposure based on the existing evidence. So I certainly don't think we want to diminish childhood exposure in any way. If they want to have a more nuanced view, that's fine, but I don't know that that's the purpose or necessary. So I agree with Susan.
Okay, so we'll get some edits to that text. Anything else on the integrated summary or Appendix 12? All right, so we have several things to come back to, but I think we need a break first. It will be really important that when we come back to these things that we don't take too long, because we still have our letter left. Okay, it's only 5 pages, but we need to give it enough time, because that's the distillation of our consensus comments, and that's what's going to get the most attention overall. So just make sure we don't run out of time today. So 5-minute break, and then we'll circle back. You all can help me figure out the order if you've got a preference. We've got to come back to Appendix 11, causality conclusions. We've got to come back to Appendix 1, conversation about the monitoring network, and try to reach consensus or be clear if we have lack of consensus. And I think those are the 2 big things. Please help me, whoever, if I've missed anything, and we can revisit that when we come back from break. So 5 minutes, we'll see you back. All right, are people back? No, it's a short break. I'm worried about the time. I recommend that we come back to Appendix 1 first, unless I hear strongly otherwise. And so I'm going to ask Judy if she can summarize where we are with Appendix 1 edits. I know there were some iterations offline with a subgroup and some different perspectives that we still need to address. And particularly, I think we're trying to clarify the monitoring network with respect to what's done for compliance versus what's done for research purposes and what we are actually recommending or just wishing for. I think those are some of the key points as I understand them. Judy, are you able to weigh in on this?
Yeah, that I didn't get much feedback, and that from my revised version I sent out yesterday, that Perry has some questions, suggestions, and comments. So that, see, we're talking about, let me see if I can find Perry. Perry has some, is that to the code group? Let's see. I guess not the entire group is getting it. So getting my revised version, right?
I'll have to look and see who saw what.
That's right. That's it. So anyway, that's okay. Let me, Aaron, can you put that on for the part I highlighted? Was the addition? Maybe that will help. Those are the new one. Nobody else except for the group. Perry have some question that I can address. Or Georgia.
Yeah. And I see maybe while Aaron's figuring that out, we can invite Perry and Bruce who have their hands up to comment, and maybe that'll help us get through this.
Okay.
In the interest of time, I thought we were pretty close and we just really needed to do some fine edits that we might be able to do offline, but that's up to the group.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So that we were talking a bit about, they have this monitoring criteria was set for 0.5 tons per year or 1 tons per year for either airport or non-airport or non-sources oriented site to have a site to really get additional sites. Unless there is a change in the monitoring criteria that was set forth in 2010, there's a lack of justification to request additional TSP monitoring. And I think Jim alluded that yesterday as well. So most of I know Perry want to be more of TSP monitoring. Most of TSP monitoring is source oriented, whereas in this case, we emphasize community exposure or population oriented monitoring in all size fractions. I try to make it vague. It's not really for compliance unless EPA can change the criteria or add additional sites. So this paragraph here that highlight in yellow, if everybody can see, what happened is I look it back into the Federal Register. So this site-specific emission, they actually range from 0.32 to 4.9 tons per year based on the 2002 and 2005 National Emission Inventory. And then this is published in 2010. So my point here, Terry has a question is, they have not changed that criteria to monitoring site. That's why maybe state of Georgia, many states do not even have any site. The whole nation has 164 sites. And give some perspective, the FRM for PM 2.5 is like 1,200 sites. So we are basically a few percentage of that for the lead monitoring network. So this, I add the sentence here, the monitoring criteria were based on the radio data and the adequacy of those ambient PM lead monitoring criteria that to protect vulnerable population needs to be reevaluated. And thanks for Bruce send 3 references which will be appended to the end of this consensus summary for the whole document. So that's something that want to, just to clarify, in order to ask EPA to know that to add additional site, you have to basically ask them to reevaluate those old criteria to set up the site. Am I make myself clear?
That sounds clear. Bruce, did Bruce has his hand up? Should we have him weigh in also?
Sorry, Bruce. Yeah.
No worries. Thank you, Judy, and thank you for the revisions. I think they go a long way to addressing the issues. I think what we're trying to get at is that there's certainly growing evidence, if not sufficient evidence, to say that the data we're getting from the air monitoring network, if you can call it a network, it sounds so skimpy. It seems to me it's not even a network. Is just inadequate. We don't know what the exposures are to airborne lead across the country. We only know in a few places. We don't know when there's peaks. We don't know around airports that are using leaded aviation fuel. We just don't know. And so what we're really trying to do here is to say, well, how can we get better information? There's 2 approaches. There's the research avenue. We have recommendations for research. There's the lowering the compliance level so that there's more monitoring that's being done around perhaps potential sources. One of the things that I struggle with in this area is I don't have a lot of confidence, and it's terrible for me to say this, that if we make a recommendation that EPA will follow it. Now, I say that because we said this 10 years, 20 years ago, and nothing really happened. So that's a different issue. But one thought I had would be to simply add a list of very specific research questions, because I reckon that maybe there's more we can get out of the research without having to worry right now about changing the compliance issues, which can only happen presumably after the policy changes. Maybe that's not right. Maybe we should stick with the compliance as well. Maybe we should say both, because somehow we need to get this information. The compliance by itself, of course, will be inadequate. It will be spotty. It will be better than what we have. Absolutely, we need it. But the real question is, how do we get a picture of what's happening nationally? How do we set ourselves up to be able to answer questions just like we're able to answer with PM 2.5 studies? I mean, if you just look at, there's thousands of studies looking at PM 2.5 and respiratory outcomes and cardiovascular disease and mortality and blah, 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 right? Well, of course there is, because there's so many monitors out there. We can't even begin to do those studies with lead because there's just no information. So I thought maybe one thing that we could add would be to very specifically call out, this was George's idea, that EPA should test FMR samples collected over the past 7 years to examine population level exposures to airborne lead. And by using existing cohort studies or national surveys, examine exposure response relationship for key health outcomes like blood lead concentrations, preterm birth, and coronary heart disease. Number 2, EPA should expand the nationwide network, or maybe develop a nationwide network, so researchers can examine the shape of the exposure response relationship with various health outcomes and national surveys, examine sources of lead below the current lead NACs, and test whether lead in PM 2.5, PM10, or TSP are more strongly associated with blood lead concentrations and adverse health endpoints. So basically, let's do what we've been able to do with PM 2.5 from a research perspective, so that we can better understand what's going on. So in 5 years, when we come back, we have more evidence about what's the impact at lower and lower levels of lead.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I have modify the sentence in the letter sent to Leanne and Aaron. And just to wrap this up, that we did address both issues. Then the sentence I had at the end of the page, whatever, is that this page here, the deployment of additional non-compliance research monitors to assess population exposure for several size fractions, including TSP, PM10, PM2.5, should include measurement to evaluate airborne lead exposure below the current NEX. So that's the issue. We really ask for them to deploy additional monitor below the additional text. So next page, and thanks, Aaron. Yeah, and so thanks for Christina's question yesterday. The first yellow highlights here, I put because some of the sites have really high concentration. Additional neighborhood scale, I put this parenthesis population-oriented monitoring. That's in the 40 CFR called the federal registration to target community in proximity to lead emission sources warranted to ensure safe exposure level. We're not talking about attainment. We're talking about neighborhood scale population oriented monitoring to target to protect those community. The next paragraph I'm not going to read. That's just some editing with respect to George's input. George, you want to elaborate on that because Perry did have some question on that.
Yeah, and if we can address this offline, I think we, in the interest of time, if it's minor, maybe we should. Perry, is that okay if you had questions? Yeah, you're muted, but yes, I see you shaking your head, yes.
There's consensus around this and what Bruce just said, and thank you, Judy, for preparing this. I just think there's a few minor edits.
Okay.
Okay, that's good because George's part we discussed yesterday already. I just rearranged it, did some editing.
Okay.
And that's all of it, Leanne.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we can move forward with this and fine tune it a little bit more as needed. The other thing that we needed to revisit was Appendix 11. So I'm going to call on Bill and Chris to help us with whether we are recommending any changes to the causal conclusions or whether that was just a little bit of a minor edit for clarity that we needed in Appendix 11. And I'll go back while you all are getting up. I'll go back and see where this was in the document.
Got to write my notes. Sorry.
Yeah.
So the table's on page 172 that calls out the causalities, and I guess at least in Appendix 11, it's that page. I'm looking now for our notes. So it was line 30. It says, although there's a lot of information on freshwater. A lot of the marine were judged inadequate or suggestive. And the reason that I raised that question is that in that previous table, it showed that there was inadequate data for evaluating survival, growth, and reproductive effects for a number of different species. And I either I misunderstand or how this evaluation is to be done, but they go on and reference the Church 2017 article in there. And I went back just now to the supplemental data from the Church article, and they list 105 toxicity tests representing 54 species and 49 genera that all had LC50s and also reported effects on growth and reproduction. And so I find it hard to believe that there's insufficient information to say that lead can cause survival effects in marine species. So I guess my suggestion, and Chris, we haven't had a chance to talk about this offline or at all. But I guess my recommendation would be to have them go back and reevaluate the data that is listed in the supplemental tables to Church 2017 and reassess their causality conclusions with regard to that. If that seems reasonable to folks.
That seems like a reasonable recommendation. We're not actually recommending a specific change. We're saying, go back and we think there's reason to think it should be more stringent is what I'm hearing you say. And I think we might want to be explicit based on what we see, but we're not ready to tell them to do that. We're just saying, go back and look and decide.
Well, even the Office of Water in the 1985 water quality criteria had 13 marine LC50 values, and it would seem to me that they'd reached the conclusion that lead could cause toxicity to marine species.
Okay.
Chris, that copacetic?
Yeah, it's all great with me.
All right. So I think we're done with the two things we need to circle back on. Anything else about consensus comments before we leave them? And if not, we are going to go all the way back to the beginning of the document and to the letter, which, as I said, is a distillation of our consensus comments. And we will start on page L1. And so the first paragraph's just kind of boilerplate standard language. The paragraph that starts on page 26 to 34 summarizes Appendix 1. And I haven't revisited this, but my guess is based on some of our conversation, including what we just had, there may be a sentence or two that needs to be addressed, and maybe Judy's already thought about this and I missed it. Anyway, any comments on Appendix 1? George?
If I recall correctly from yesterday, we thought that maybe elevating the ask for the retrospective lead analysis from existing filters warranted a quick note in the letter. I believe that's what we had discussed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I sent the last sentence on line 33. I recommend the changes to future research these pertaining to additional non-compliance monitoring and initiate lead analysis in the archived PM 2.5 FRM filters to assess population exposure below the current standard. Are recommended or, encouraged.
Well, that's
long sentence.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, I captured the important part, but I just started to realize it's a bit long sentence. Future research need to pertain basically post monitoring, like Bruce talked about, and initiate lead field analysis on the archive field, and Aaron, you had the detailed language. And I think it's important to point out we really like to assess population exposure below the current standard. So, and probably just can end there. Just end the sentence below the current standard.
So my question is, is this something we're recommending or encouraging? Because you said you use both words.
That's why I say that's why I was stopped, because I was sure we recommend or encourage. I think recommending probably be good. What do you think, Bruce? Is that capture what we want to do? I encouraged or strongly encouraged.
Well, given Jim's comments yesterday that I think might have just been amongst a few of us about the cost of changing compliance increasing compliance monitoring, I definitely think we want to recommend going back and looking at the past 7 years as part of a research recommendation, strong recommendation, so that we have, all those bullet points to look at effects below the current NACs, to look at the shape of the dose response and so on. So definitely for the research, I think, and I even think we should have its own paragraph. I think it's that important. About the compliance and some of the issues I think Jim will talk about, I think might deserve a bit more conversation. Compliance monitoring, excuse me.
So Judy, you still have your hand up, or you, can I go on to Perry?
Okay, I was just going to say that I think we should have also in here something about the increasing the number of monitoring sites by changing the criteria, as we just discussed a few minutes ago. So it's not just the research part.
Jim.
Yeah, so I guess as far as, I'm all for increasing number of monitoring for research purposes. When we ask EPA to increase the number of compliance monitors, EPA doesn't do any monitoring. They come back to the states and tell the states to do the monitoring. The states are the ones doing that. They usually don't give the states any additional money to do this monitoring. So it's the states who are doing this, and with limited resources, states prefer to do compliance monitoring over research monitoring typically. But my main point is, I haven't seen, I've seen discussions that there's effects below the current level of the NACs, and to me that's evidence that maybe the NACs needs to be lowered. And but I haven't seen any evidence that at the current areas where we areas that are above the 0.5, or that there's areas below the 0.5 tons per year, that there are not NACs violations. I mean, that would be the reason for increasing the number of compliance monitors, is if we thought below 0.5 tons per year there were point sources that were violating the NACs, and I just haven't seen any evidence to that effect. That's why I'm not in favor of lowering the threshold to require more compliance monitors. I am in favor of, weighing the filters that have been collected over the last 7 years, looking at the, the CSN data, looking at the improved data, and even requesting additional monitoring for research purposes, which hopefully won't get passed on to the states. And, EPA can do that through grant money and things like that to universities. So I'm in favor of all the research, requesting additional research and everything that we talked about. So I'm in favor of that, but I am not in favor of increasing the number of compliance monitors or dropping the requirements, the 0.5 ton per year requirement for point sources, or the 1 ton per year for airports. So.
Okay, and one of the points I want to make is the letter is meant to be a summary of what we've agreed upon in the consensus comments. I thought we had consensus on a bunch of these points, so I'm a little bit lost here.
Well, actually, going back, I don't think Judy's letter or Judy's additions to the last chapter actually recommended lowering the thresholds. I saw it may have said EPA should maybe go back and look at the thresholds, but Judy's edits did not say that the threshold 0.5 should be lowered, and that's why I'm okay with all Judy's edits, and in the that we just talked about, I'm good with all that.
But
we're going to summarize that. We're not going to make something new.
How about this? How about CASAC recommends it strikes out the last sentence, future research. Just say CASAC recommends to evaluate the current monitoring criteria, expand the non-compliance research monitoring, and initiate lead analysis with the archived PM2.5 FRM filters to assess population exposure below the current standard. Is that a good sentence?
It works for me. Does it work for the experts? I see George and Perry and Christina all have their hands up. So go ahead, George.
Gosh, I just wanted to basically agree with Jim. I mean, assuming we're talking about the current NACs, and I'm sorry, this is more like Appendix 1 again, doing compliance monitoring, which implies TSP high vols, that's going to be a non-starter. I work with a lot of state agencies that do monitoring, and there's no way they're going to participate in putting out a large network of high vols. That ain't going to happen. Now,
All right.
potentially,
We're in the letter, so we're not,
Yep.
we didn't go there in Appendix 1, so we're not going there now.
Okay.
Let's just keep going with, sorry to cut you off. I'm
No,
just
no,
worried
no, that's fine.
that we're going to get lost and we're going to run out of time because we got a lot of other things to cover. Perry.
Well, I would just say, and Leanne, correct me if I'm wrong, or Aaron, I believe that we're not considering economics in our evaluation of the ISA. It's my understanding that we're making scientific judgments. And if we're noticing that there's a disappearing monitoring network that is currently mandated by EPA, we should make the comment that more monitoring is needed in the future. It has nothing to do whether the monitoring shows that sites are in or out of compliance. We're just saying there should be monitoring to make that determination, not just in the past, but in the future. How do we know that sites will stay in compliance? And it has nothing to do with what the NAC standard is. It has to do with having a national monitoring network. Thank you.
Okay, so Judy proposed a sentence. I think that covers these points. I think we need to move on. Thank you for those comments. A couple of hands just went down. Now one came up. Jim.
I had on a different topic. So if we're done with this topic, I wanted to bring up something else.
Okay, is for Appendix 1?
Yes.
Okay.
So we have this sentence in there, lines 31 to 32, talking about the companion document. And I like that sentence in there. What I'd like to propose is at the end of that sentence at line 33, and this is something that a bunch of people, I believe, agree to. I'd like to add this sentence that says, however, many of the figures and tables in that document should be included in the ISA, period, because I think while we recognize that companion document is very useful, and EPA's plan is to continuously update that document as new information comes available, none of that information is actually in the ISA itself. And I think it's important to actually have those figures and tables in the ISA. And it also documents, where the science was at the point that the ISA was released to the public. So I was proposing to add that one extra sentence and wanted to put that out to the group.
Sure, that sounds reasonable to me. And we should make sure, presumably it's already in the Appendix 1 consensus comments. So you're just bringing that forward.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is included.
Okay, good. Appendix 2. And, at this point, given we only have an hour and a half left, I'm really looking for people who want to make changes to the letter, that you propose very specific changes. Otherwise, if we can't be deliberating anymore about things. We've already deliberated on what we think about the various responses of the consensus. And what we're really trying to do here is make sure that we've distilled that clearly and in important ways. So if you have, I embrace changes to this letter, but I would like us to focus on very specific text. So Joel. You are muted. You're still muted. Joel, you're still muted.
Joel, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Why don't we move on to Susan, and when Joel can when asked to unmute. Joel, when you unmute, we'll be happy to hear from you. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Okay. Sorry. Yes. Well, Leanne, I would like to have a couple sentences added to this paragraph. that would focus on Brian Schwartz's recommendation to minimize the use of the generic term bone lead and instead clarify this text by using skeletal lead when referring to the body burden of bone lead simulated by modeling, but use the specific name of the bones measured, or at least the descriptors of cortical or trabecular bone for the in vivo XRF measurements. It just needs to start in this chapter, but be carried throughout the document.
Okay, and if you have specific, if you have specific suggestions about where and what, that would be awesome. If you don't have it written now, I think we can address it offline because we know your intent. Thank you, and we appreciate getting that follow-up. Susan.
Yeah, I mean, I just had two minor suggestions in my, which I don't think we need to all talk about, that you probably saw. So if any of those need, in terms of clarifying the cancer, and also just in terms of what's a priority comment regarding the health appendices.
Oh, you're on to the health appendices.
Okay, sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I have a couple of notes about your comments we can look at. So we're done with Appendix 2, is that right? Or Perry, do you have a comment about Appendix 2? You're muted. You're still muted. Why are people?
My comment was for page 24, 25, line 2. Is that part of this?
Wait a minute. We're on the letter.
In the letter, yes. Page L2.
Page L2, 24, 25. Yeah,
Correct.
that's also the health. I guess we're on to the health. Susan had mentioned the health, and I'm going to assume we're on to the health. So yes, we're on to the letter page starting in line 9. Looks like all of L2 and well, let's just do L2, page L2. So you wanted to go ahead, Perry, and then we'll come back to Susan.
Okay, mine was a very small point on line 24, 25 in regards to hypertension. I don't believe the intent was to say that hypertension is not associated with blood lead levels. And I think maybe the easy thing to do would be to get rid of the parentheses, but I'll leave that up to the editors.
Okay.
Or sorry, this is Mark, or just replace the but not with a than, right? Isn't that,
Okay, we're going to wordsmith that to make it clear that we're not saying that hypertension is not associated. And somebody's going to help me, like Mark or Perry or Susan or somebody. So Susan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just for on page L2 for the summary of the most salient parts of the causality determination comments. I do think the inconsistency in the document regarding whether effect estimates or precision were prioritized in causality determinations is pretty important. So, for some outcomes, the pattern of causality was largely based on consistency of effect estimates, even if they were imprecise and included the null. And in other outcomes, nothing was considered relevant if it wasn't statistically significant. And there was a fair amount of inconsistency depending on the outcome. And I think that needs to be done. That's a very fundamental part of the analysis process that should be more standard.
Okay, so are you suggesting a change to the paragraph that's lines 9 to 18? Is that where you are?
I guess I'm just suggesting in the section where you're talking about all the different issues regarding causality determination, there should be an additional comment on this.
I think that's the next paragraph, right?
Starting on like 20, yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you.
Yeah.
And so we need to add a comment. And can you provide some text? to
Yeah,
that?
I have some text I can offer. Yeah.
Maybe looks like you might have actually.
Yeah, I did that, but I can send it again.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Mark. Oh,
Yes.
wait a minute, Weisskopf first. Sorry.
Sorry. Confusion. Yeah, so I just had a question in the paragraph that's lines 9 through 18. At line 14, there's a phrase that says, well, it's the part that's overstating limitations of the cross-sectional study design, and not adequately considering limitations in the longitudinal study design. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I know there was issues about overstating the limitations of the cross-sectional, but I mean, in general, I would have thought a longitudinal study is better, and so I'm a little confused, and I don't remember. Maybe I'm forgetting our prior discussion, but where is that coming from? That's making it sound like longitudinal studies have a lot of limitations, which they can have some, but not to the extent probably of cross-sectional. Anyway, I found that confusing.
So can I respond? Because I think that came from some stuff that, well, Brisa also, in the discussions we talked about, sometimes there's bias and follow-up in longitudinal studies. So not all longitudinal studies lack bias. And I think there was a lack of acknowledgement that just because a study is longitudinal doesn't mean that it doesn't have limitations related to retention bias or other issues that need to at least be acknowledged. And so I think that's where that came from, as far as I recall. Brisa, you.
Yeah, so that was, yeah, sorry, Brisa, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly where it came from in the index for the cardiovascular risk. There were 2 longitudinal studies that were cited as, strong evidence, but in fact, one had a very large dropout and the other one had a very high exposure level. So they were not really that relevant for the, for general population.
Okay, yeah, so I certainly don't disagree, and those things can crop up. I guess when I read that sentence, not having sort of forgotten our discussion, it kind of sounded to me like we were saying cross-sectionals are better than longitudinals. I know that's not what's necessarily being said, but I wonder whether there could be some smithing of that sentence to.
Okay. Yeah, and I think what happened, if I remember correctly, for distillation of the letter, is that we took some of these points and put them into like these brief summary phrases. And if the summary phrases is misleading, yeah, we should revise. So.
Okay, I remember this discussion. I can try and suggest something. I'll try and.
That would be great.
Craft some.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now on to Mark Frampton.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking at line 35 on page L2, that sentence that says CASAC recommends considering a hierarchy of human versus animal evidence. So we talked about that in the consensus statement. So I would suggest that sentence needs to come out.
Okay. So that's just consistent with what our discussion yesterday. So,
yes.
Okay.
And Leanne, I did provide a sentence as I was instructed about weakening that, making it a suggestion, and to use a very specific example. For example, what I understood, now you said this was for immunologic effects. What I understood was that the preterm birth and preeclampsia, even though the evidence might be strong for humans, it was not strong for the toxicologic data. Therefore, it wasn't considered causal. So whether we include that or not, it's not critical, but that was that sentence you'd asked me to revise, and I sent that to you and Aaron yesterday.
Okay, thank you. And my guess is that maybe we can use that to guide how I mean, Mark, if you're okay with maybe we based on the discussion and what Bruce just suggested, instead of removing it, we change the change it to reflect our discussion more clearly. I don't, probably the example wouldn't make it in the letter, but I think the point is that we reflect our conversation yesterday and either remove the sentence altogether or put in something else that makes it clear what our point is.
Yeah, as long as the language doesn't either recommend or suggest a hierarchy of evidence.
Okay.
Global, speaking globally. If you know, it should be. You could use it in a specific instance. You could say here the human data should be considered more heavily than the animal data because of this and that. That's fine, but I think we need to avoid the global hierarchy.
I think I used the word consider, Mark, so I think it's consistent.
Okay.
Well, I don't think we should even ask them to consider that. I think that's wrong.
You mean the hierarchy? And I'm not, if Bruce, I'm not able to pull your sentence up at the moment, but
it's not about the hierarchy. No, I think what Mark is saying is consistent with what I wrote.
Okay.
I'll share it with you, Mark, and you can pass on your comments.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, we'll get that cleaned up. So we're working on, I'm assuming we have finished a while ago with the paragraph 9 to 18, and we are working on paragraph 20 to 41, and there were a couple of things we need to clean up with respect to bone lead. And Perry already mentioned something about the hypertension we're going to fix. And then Susan, looks like you had a comment. The relative importance of the consistency of effect estimates across. So did you elaborate sufficiently on that already?
Yeah, I think we're good. I'll send you some language.
Okay. All right, Mark, you have your hand up again. You're muted anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Are we moving on then? I have a comment on page L3, but
if people are ready to move on, yes, let's do it. Time is getting short, so let's move on to L3 through line 26. So that will wrap up the health all the way through to the end of line 26. And so any input on the health parts of our letter. And Mark, you have some stuff to say.
Yeah, so just line 7 and 8 on page L3 about renal effects. For renal effects, CASAC believes that the causality determinations will be strengthened by inclusion of evidence from a randomized controlled trial. And this is just a wording issue, but when I read that initially, it sounds like we're asking for a randomized controlled trial of lead exposure to be done. And I think what is meant is that a study that was not included, and I think this was randomized controlled trial of chelation, correct me if I'm wrong. Nobody's going to do a randomized controlled trial of lead exposure, obviously. So this is chelation therapy for lead, and hopefully that's where that comes from. So that just should be added and the reference cited here. Just to be clear, we're citing a study that should be included. We're not asking that a study be done.
Yeah, okay. And Mark Weisskopf, do you have a follow-up on that, or you have a different point?
Different point.
Okay, I think that's enough on that point. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify where we are with it's lines 2, 3, 4, I guess, about the neurodegenerative disorders. That whatever that sentence is needs to line up with where we landed on recommended. I forget what's could recommended, what language gets used, but I think we were deciding to keep it as combined now, but suggest they may need to break it out in the future. And should that sentence reflect that?
Yes, that needs to update. And right, thank you. And we haven't done it yet. Sometimes we try to do it before the second day. We will, we will make sure that whatever specific decisions were made in the consensus comments get carried forward into the letter. So if there were changes like that, it's no harm in pointing them out, but there is, our intent is that the letter will reflect the consensus comments and not say something different.
Okay, then, and that obviously applies to the reproductive section too.
Yeah. Okay, anything else on the health? There was a couple of comments for the last sentence. Susan was one of them, Brian Schwartz was the other on the cancer, line 25 to 26. Is that what you were going to say, Susan? You were going to say something else?
Yeah, no, that was it. Just, I mean, the recommendation to acknowledge the animal studies is important, but also the way it's worded makes it sound like it's based on human epi-evidence, which it's not. So the acknowledgement of what it's based on and correction of what it's not based on, I think, are both equally important.
Okay. We'll make sure to get that in, and thank you for providing that in advance. Anything else on health? Mark Frampton.
Yes, down at the end, the very end, bottom of page L4, top of L5, the paragraph where it says discussion of blood pressure effects. I just thought this needed to be clarified with a little wordsmithing and maybe just add to the end of the sentence, add at similar exposure concentrations.
Yeah, okay, so this is a health related topic, but it was from the executive summary piece. So yes.
Oh, is that the exact? Oh, I'm sorry.
Fine. It's no problem. No problem. We need to get it all out in public. So I'm going to ask that we go back to L3, line 28, which is Appendix 11. And we had a comment from Brian Schwartz about the first sentence, implying that Appendix 11 is about toxicity data. It's just misleading. So we need
That's
to.
a minor semantic issue, Leanne. I don't think it matters.
Okay, thank you. We'll wordsmith that. And let's see. I thought the on line 40, the 40 to 41, the phrase like metals cooperative research and development agreement could probably be dropped from the letter. That's also minor. Anything else?
Is there a reason for that specifically, Leanne?
I just seemed unnecessary detail since it's in the consensus comments, but if you
No. I just wanted to make sure that it highlighted the fact that the CRADA agreement did exist. So
yeah, so it's not like we're removing it from the document. It's
got
like
it.
The distillation doesn't need to have those details. They're in the consensus comments.
I'm good with it.
Okay. So also the paragraph on L4, lines 1 through 19. And I think I flagged the sentence that's on lines 12 to 14, but that we just had a discussion about that. So I think that's just bringing forward what we're recommending with respect to updating causality conclusions, which we're just recommending that EPA do what we just talked about, was just doing a more thorough review and considering changing some of those conclusions. So we'll update that sentence to reflect that. Is there anything else in the Appendix 11, 2 paragraphs in the letter?
So on line 9, the neurobehavioral effects on aquatic invertebrates, CASAC finds the causality determination could be upgraded. I just suggested modifying it that CASAC suggests that EPA reconsider the finding that the causality determination should be upgraded to or could be upgraded to causal. That purely editorial.
Okay, all right. And it'll be really helpful to send that along to Aaron.
Got it.
Or make sure that he's got it when you review the letter, when it comes out for review. I think we're on in the letter to line 21 to 36, L4. That's the Appendix 12. And we already heard now all the way to the end of the letter, which includes the executive summary. And we've already heard from Mark his clarification on lines 44 to 45. So that concludes the letter. And now, after worrying that we were going to run out of time, we've got an hour left. So we could wrap up, or I'm wondering if anybody needs to clear their head, if we should take another short break before we wrap up, just to make sure that we've not missed anything. If anybody needs a few minutes to think about it, or are we far enough along that we don't need more thought? Yeah, Brian.
So I love to end. I'd love to get that hour back, but I am just so curious to understand this kind of difference between Bruce and Jim about the value of added monitoring, and whether, Bruce, you should be more specific about where you see those added monitors going to capture which kinds of exposures, because we've consistently heard from Jim that he thinks that adding new monitors based on the half a ton of lead is not a well-spent investment. So maybe we could do this offline, but I'd love to hear more about where this disagreement, it seems pretty fundamental to me, and I'm trying to understand where it's coming from.
Yeah, it's less for me. It's less about let's say, I think there's no question we need to have better nationwide measures of exposure, period. That's the first statement, and it's absolutely true, and it's really important, and I think it even almost deserves its own little paragraph in the letter. Whether we get that or not, it doesn't matter. Well, we're missing what I think we're missing is in large part because we've made assumptions about the exposures are only important if they're above some value, right? So based upon the existing NACs, we're saying, in effect, we are not worried about lower exposures. Now, maybe that was true 20 years ago, probably wasn't very thoughtful, but maybe it was true 20 years ago. It's no longer true. The evidence is clearly pointing to suggest that there are likely to be effects at even lower and lower exposures. So that means we need to do a better job measuring airborne lead nationwide to get at some of the research questions I talked about. I don't think I need to go over those again, but there's no question we need better research. We need data that people can incorporate into existing cohorts. So we should absolutely strongly recommend more monitors, for research purposes to answer all those questions. When it comes to the compliance monitors and using that cut point, would it be useful? Absolutely. When we looked at the exposures of the children around the Reed Hillview Airport, we found that for those children most heavily exposed, this is a vulnerable population, a minority population, based upon the air, from the air emissions alone, we estimated that 14% exceeded 3.5 microgram per deciliter because of the exposures from avgas. We don't have any data on air monitors from that site. How can we not have data from that site? That just, it doesn't make sense. So reducing the increasing the number of compliance monitors for those situations would absolutely help. How do we get there from where we are today? Even if we recommend those compliance monitors, will it happen? Or is it based upon, and I think Judy suggested it might because it's somewhat arbitrary, but it's going to be based upon, maybe it'll increase the number of air monitors by 10% or 15%. And maybe Jim or George have better estimates on that. It will give us some better information about potential hot spots, because that's where the monitors would go. Would that be useful? Absolutely. But it seems to me that in the short term, we absolutely could use those. For me, I guess I'm emphasizing the longer term strategy. And what's perhaps most troubling to me is, even if we make both these recommendations, I just don't know that, I don't have a lot of confidence.
Either of them. I don't
Okay.
think that, but there you go.
Yeah, so a couple hands up. I think I'm gonna go out of order and invite Deidre Murphy to weigh in. I think she's probably gonna help us say that this is maybe more of a consideration for the policy assessment, might be part of what she's gonna say. Because they always ask us about future research in the policy assessment reviews.
Sure, that's true, Leanne. I agree with what you're suggesting. I was also going to provide perhaps Kevin Cavender the opportunity of clarifying some things about the monitoring requirements. It sounded like there were different backgrounds on the panel in terms of their depth of knowledge and familiarity, and it might be useful for that clarity if y'all think that would be. And then the other thing I was going to mention is there are monitoring data at Reed Hillview Airport. That was one of the airports where that was part of the pilot study instituted with the monitoring requirements back in 2010. So those data are there. But I don't know, Kevin Cavender, are you on now? That maybe you could clarify what the requirements are for citing, and I could perhaps clarify to begin with that the compliance monitor refers to putting monitors in locations where there's a potential to exceed the NAAQS. It's a surveillance network to try to find places that might be exceeding the NAAQS so that we can take care of them. And so the requirements are in regulation to handle that specificity. There are also other monitoring requirements that people on the call are very familiar with in terms of collecting other types of data that are useful to EPA's work. And so is Kevin on? I'm not seeing his picture, and I was by email, I thought he was on. Is he, can anybody see him on the list?
I'm on.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Kevin. Do you want to help just a couple, just 2 minutes on the different types of monitors that EPA talks about that can have and how they differ from compliance or surveillance network monitors?
Sure, I'll try. I think several of you have a pretty good handle on our requirements, and maybe this will be helpful for those that are a little confused. So as Deirdre mentioned, the primary purpose of our NAAQS monitors are to identify areas of non-compliance with the NAAQS. So we have attempted to identify kind of an emission threshold where we thought the potential for that to occur was high enough at least to warrant putting a monitor out there to find more. So we have that emission threshold of 0.5. We did a number of different analyses to come up with that, some simplistic modeling, some looking at some of the data we had available to us, et cetera, to come up with that threshold.
one thing I wanted to make sure people were also aware of, we also have in our requirements the ability to shut a monitor down once that threshold has been triggered and monitors have been put out. So we have a 50% of the NACS threshold. If a 3-year design value shows the concentration less than half the NACS, we allow states to petition to take that monitor down, because again, as Jim mentioned, we're very aware that the budgets are very tight in our monitoring organizations, and we want to have high value monitors out there.
All right. Is that it? Or
yep. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. And Deidre, I assume you're finished. Yeah. So Bruce, and then Jim, and then and Judy, and then maybe we can leave this topic. We've spent a lot of time in these 2 days on this one topic. Bruce.
Yeah, well, and I think this is probably one of the more important things that we can recommend. So I think it's worth some discussion. I just wanted to clarify that what I understand is Deirdre just said that we do have air monitoring data from Reed Hillview. As I recall, it was from 2008 to 2010. Presumably, if it was shut down, it meant because the air lead levels were below the 50% of the NAC. And yet, as I mentioned, 1 in 6 children had blood lead levels in excess of 3.5 microgram per deciliter. So clearly there's a mismatch there. And then I just wanted to point out to Kevin, and I know Kevin, you know this quite well, as everybody at EPA does, but sometimes maybe we forget it. All the evidence would suggest that if we can reduce these exposures, of course, it will be cost beneficial. So I realize in the short term, we often get stuck on the economic hurdles, but everything I've seen with lead and certainly with PM 2.5 would suggest that these are good investments. So I don't think we should allow ourselves to get stuck in the short-term economic obstacles.
All right, Jim.
Yeah, this will be quick. I know, later on we'll be talking in the policy assessment, Bruce has presented evidence that could be used in the policy assessment to recommend lowering the NACS. If the CASAC is recommending to lower the NACS when we get to the policy assessment, I think what goes hand in hand with that is we need more monitors out there, and monitors that have been shut down need to come back. So, I mean, I think under the current NACS, we don't need more compliance monitors. If CASAC was to recommend lowering the NACS to a lower number, I'm all in favor of lowering that threshold from a half a ton to a, 0.25 tons or whatever the number is to get more monitors out there. So I think this is a question that will come back up when we do the policy assessment, and depending on what the CASAC ultimate recommendation is, I think we'll come back to this recommendation for compliance monitors.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin and DJ, for the clarification. That one thing, when I look back to the Federal Register 2010, the site-specific emission threshold is somewhat arbitrary. They are based on very limited 7 facilities, then they exclude 3 out of 7 as outlier. So the numbers are all over the place. So that's why I felt that this 0.5 and 1, and then they come out with 0.5 and 1 with tons per year. So it's probably worthwhile to look back, to reevaluate this, and then to lower the threshold.
Thank you. That's helpful insight into the comments we've written up. Christina.
So my question is that we would just explain how states can petition to shut down monitors. But what are the guidelines to start monitoring again if there's deemed to be maybe a reason to do so in the future? Or are there guidelines for that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much, since this is not really our realm, we want to spend time on this. I expect that some of the people, Jim being one of them, George probably also, plus some of the EPA folks, could answer that. I don't want to skip over your question. If we can get a like short answer, so we're not too bogged down on this, that would be okay. Are you ready to do that, George, since your hand's up next?
I have to ask Christina to repeat the question in short form.
So so states can shut down monitors. Can they start monitors?
Can they
like
restart
new
them?
ones or
Yeah.
restart them?
Well,
Yeah,
they can. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that says EPA is never going to say to a state you can't monitor. How's that? But again, if we've been struggling with the word compliance monitoring, that explicitly implies that it's monitoring to determine if a site is in compliance with the existing NACs. Now, that's a completely different topic than research-related monitoring. And I think that's something that we've misused the term a bit. But I also wanted to emphasize that, as I was saying earlier, high vols are probably a non-starter for a place that's in compliance. But for research and survey work, the low vol TSP sampler, which ORD, Bob Vanderpool, and colleagues have characterized, is relatively easy to run and gives you data that, at least in my humble opinion, is as good as a high vol. The numbers are slightly different, but the high vol is far from a good monitor. So if we're talking about looking at larger particles, I just will once again say, please don't try to recommend that states put out a bunch of high vols. That would probably be a non-starter. I just want to emphasize that, and the alternative of the low vol TSP sampler, which is out there and available today.
Okay, Deidre, you maybe, and Kevin, one or both of you maybe are in a better position to answer Christina's question. And again, I don't want us to spend too long on these details, but since it's sort of outside of what our job is.
Of course, and Kevin is the best. If he misses it, I can help you clarify, but go, Kevin.
So actually, I kind of got lost in what I was saying earlier, and it actually ties in very well to this question. We get caught up on the threshold as it's the thing that says you have to have a monitor or not. Actually, the very first line of the requirement is that monitoring is required anywhere where we suspect, the word suspect is not right, anywhere we think there's the potential to violate the NACs, whether it's a quarter of a ton, a tenth of a ton, or 10 tons. If we have a reason to believe there's going to be a violation of the NACs, particularly in areas where we think there's a lot of resuspension, maybe an old closed facility, the states have that. Well, I take that back. The EPA regional administrator has the authority to require additional monitors of the state. So the regional administrator can tell the state, hey, we think there's an issue with this facility. You should put a monitor there and we can find out. And that has happened. It continues to happen pretty regularly as issues pop up. So I just wanted to bring that out. And so there are certainly, and the other thing directly responding to that question is if a state gets a waiver to shut down a site, every 5 years, they have to reevaluate that waiver to make sure that production hasn't increased at that facility to the point that it might be now a concern.
Great. And just to clarify, so that's
you.
talking about federal requirements on where state and local authorities are required to put a monitor in. To also go back to Dr. Fuller's question, a state, of course, local agency can put that monitor up whenever they like. If they want it to be data that are used for assessing compliance with the NACs, they'll have to use the methods that would do that, but they can put their monitor up whenever they like, as George Allen said.
Thank you. And Jim, maybe you can have the last word on this topic since your hand's up.
I was about to say,
okay.
I was going to say a lot of the same stuff that Kevin said. Although Georgia has shut down all of our lead monitors, we have been recently talking with Region 4 about a facility where they, we both think that there could be potential lead issues. EPA ran a lead monitor temporarily, and if they had shown any high lead values, we as the state were committed to go and run a full-time monitor. So that, like Kevin was saying, they're on a case-by-case basis, monitors can be added.
Okay, there's clearly, we could probably spend another couple hours on this topic. So I'm going to circle back. The next thing on our agenda is for the Charter CASAC to vote on the disposition of the report. Before I get to that, I want to just make sure there are no more changes or anything else we need to visit on either the letter or the consensus comments. Christina, you have your hand up.
Yes, so I wanted to ask, like I said, it went by pretty quickly. I believe you said that there was some proposed different language for L4, 44 through 45 through the next page. Did you say there was revised language for that? And I just wanted to know what it was.
So
I remember from before.
So that L4 44, the sentence reads, in the 7.4.21 discussion of blood pressure effects, it states that the racial differences may also reflect the history of greater, is this the one?
Yes, it's just at the end of the sentence, Mark had proposed adding at similar exposure concentrations.
Right, so that would be at the end of the sentence on line 1, a history of greater lead among non-Hispanic and Black populations at similar exposure concentrations. Yes, that's the edit that Mark proposed.
Okay, thank you.
Does that mean a similar air exposure level? Because there's the use of the word exposure earlier in the sentence, which is claiming they have different exposures. So if we're saying at the same exposure levels, are we talking about ambient air, Len?
Mark, are you going to help us with this?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the document in front of me at the moment, but yeah, basically, I just thought that paragraph as it is wasn't clear. And and that was one of my proposals to try to clarify it, but I'm sorry, let me bring it up again here. I'm sorry, what page was that again?
We're talking about the bottom of page L4, the sentence that starts on line 44.
Okay. Yeah, it states these racial differences may also reflect the history of greater exposure to lead among non-Hispanic Black populations. So first thing, history of greater exposure among non-Hispanic Black compared with what? So that, so one thing that needs to be clarified is what are we comparing it to? It seems to contradict the consistent findings of greater effects in African Americans. Now, to me, I'm assuming when it says greater effects, that's due to some difference other than the air concentration levels. In other words, it seems to say, I don't know, the author here seems to be talking about greater effects not based on exposure differences, but based on some kind of inherent response. So I may be wrong about what's intended here.
Okay, and this is actually helpful because I think the edit was maybe pasted onto the sentence that ended on line 1, and I think you meant it to be pasted onto the sentence at similar exposure concentrations. So it seems to contradict the consistent findings of greater effects in African Americans at similar exposure concentrations. So that was your addition, was to the sentence that ends on line 2, not the sentence that ends on line 1. So thank you for that clarification.
But just to be clear, I mean, we've had this discussion before. I mean, I think there are 2 points going on here, right? One is that some populations can get exposed, tend to be exposed to higher levels than others, and non-Hispanic Black tends to be more exposed than white populations, for example. The second issue is that even at the same level of exposure, there is evidence that in non-Hispanic Blacks or some populations, we see a greater dose response effect. So I don't know whether the I'm not actually sure there's a contradiction here, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it's not clear to me which of those or both of those, whether this section is talking about, one or both of those issues. And so maybe I'll step back on my suggested edit and just ask that we understand what is intended here in this sentence.
And we did have some discussion about this point in the consensus comments. I'm not remembering now if it was in the executive summary or if it was in one of the appendices. But we should be able to bring forward that.
Yeah, if we could just bring that forward, and that should make this clearer.
Yeah, I don't remember what exactly was written about in the consensus, but I think, with what I've read, that it can be both of those. We're not saying this is necessarily a contradiction because it can be both.
Part of the problem is it's not clear in the first part of the sentence, which is line 45 and line 1. It states these racial differences may also reflect the history of greater exposure to lead among non-Hispanic Black populations, but greater than what? Greater than Hispanic Blacks, or greater than non-Black, or what's the comparison that's being alluded to here?
I'm thinking the comparison is to non-Hispanic white. That's usually the default referent category, but others may be able to speak more specifically.
You're correct, Christina.
I can't remember where this is, but somewhere in the consensus statement, we advised that the EP be clear about what they meant by susceptibility, because they combined susceptibility to exposure with susceptibility to effects, and that the two are both important, but they're separate phenomena. So I think there is language in the consensus statement about clarifying that and appreciating that susceptibility is not just one thing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm fine if this be done offline, just to adjust the wording to fit what we agreed on in the consensus statement, and make sure what comparisons we're talking about are clear.
Thank you. We'll work on that offline.
Yeah, can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, I know that's offline, but I do think it needs working, and I'm happy to also help, because I think what's getting a little confused here is that the business of the inconsistent or something's not consistent with, I think comes from when we were having discussion around language in the ISA, where they sometimes were conflating one population having a worse effect because they were at a higher exposure level versus one population having a higher health problem because they had a steeper dose response at the same concentration level. And in this letter, the language right there, both of things being stated actually apply to the second thing I said. I mean, the history of greater exposure in the past may be one of the reasons why certain populations have a higher dose response now. And then that gets captured still in the language after this inconsistent sentence. So that's, I think, the thing that's trying to be said here that I think is a little unclear.
Okay.
These are comments that are also part of the integrated synthesis box, the last bullet on the integrated synthesis box on human effects. I would also like to participate in this wordsmithing that is going on now, but as you circulated, Mark, I can work on that with you too.
So, Brisa, what are you specifically talking about? Edits.
I apologize. The idea of differential exposure and differential effects that Mark was just talking about. Mark Weiskopf.
All right, so that applies to the letter, and it could be that it applies to our consensus comments in ways that hopefully we resolved already.
Yeah, so this comes from the integrated summary section of the consensus response on page 38, lines 4 through 10.
So we will look at both clarifying how this is distilled and how it's distilled and whether we need to clarify the actual consensus comments with respect to this point. And I'm not looking back at that now. We could go back to it. We've got another 40 minutes if anybody wants to.
Yeah, actually looking at that, that very phrase is there at the same levels of exposure. So I think the problem is that for the letter, we've used just the first part of that paragraph, when it's the second part that clarifies the statement. So again, just some wordsmithing of what we brought forth into the letter, I think would be helpful.
Okay.
And sorry, where were you pointing to where that is outside of the letter, the other document?
Aaron said page 38, lines 4 to 10 in our comments. So basically what the letter does, and bless his heart, Aaron does a lot of the initial passes, and I try to make sure that I think it's all clear. We take the consensus comments and we try to identify the most important aspects that we bring forward into the letter. And so, that sometimes, and it sounds like this is a place where this could happen, this happened, the distillation, something gets lost in the translation with the distillation. So that sounds like what the problem is here. So we'll fix that. And we'll make sure everybody, so in terms of next steps, we will be relying heavily on input for people who are lead or had lots of input on various sections to make edits, sort of similar to the kind of text that we've already seen for the Appendix 1 that Judy worked on yesterday. And while they're close to reaching a final conclusion about that, they still have a little more editing to go. We will be looking for input from each of you, and I could go through specific assignments, but I basically think that if you were the lead on an appendix, you're still the lead. And hopefully you've captured the main points of the discussion. Aaron and I have also been taking notes, and we will try to make sure that we're all on the same page. So if you were the lead, whether you were the lead or on the subgroup, if you had important input in our conversation over the last 2 days, I ask that you weigh in, ideally before we circulate the full draft, but certainly once we get input from everyone, Aaron and I will provide a track changes version of this document to the panel. And everyone will have a chance to make sure that what we discussed, you think got reflected. So once we approve this report today, the only thing we can do to change it is to reflect what we've talked about. We can't bring in anything new. So that's why I did wanna, and we still have a few more minutes. If anybody else needs to circle back, anything else that hasn't been said that would change what we might say about our intent, clarifying things or editing with our intent already articulated is fine. And we will, so we'll iterate with you all. I think Aaron will also send out hopefully some few things to individuals and groups that about things that he's kept notes on. And we'll have a deadline for when all of that material needs to get back, and then we'll get it back to you, and then there'll be a deadline to get this finalized. Perry, did you have questions about that?
But you also mentioned something about a vote on consensus. Could you explain that?
Yes. So before we end today, I need to poll the chartered CASAC members only, because because of the structure of the way we work, the panel helps the chartered CASAC, because frankly, there's no 7 people, I don't care who they are, that can do the work that we have done. But the chartered CASAC has to vote to approve the report. So I will be polling all chartered CASAC members who are present, and those who aren't present, I think, have already provided their votes. So that's what we're about to do.
Or the chartered members, I'm sorry.
There's 7 of us, and maybe we'll just go through that and then you'll know who they are. So we'll do the vote right now.
Okay, so the only voters are the chartered members, is that correct?
For approving the report in terms of right now in this meeting in public, but in terms of wordsmithing and getting final details, we will be looking to everyone.
Okay.
So there's the vote of approval that is the chartered CASAC, and then there is the actual finalizing the document where we're looking for everyone.
Right. Well, the reason I asked is if it was for the entire committee, I feel very strongly that this document should strongly recommend that cardiovascular mortality be called out for causal. I believe it's a disservice not to have that in the summary. And it seemed like we had a consensus for that up until today. And so I would just urge the group to consider that, the importance of that, given what other authorities have said on this topic and the consensus that we had developed.
Okay, so you want to make sure that we call out cardiovascular mortality as part of, or as sort of under the total mortality as a separate, is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I'm flexible where it goes, but I don't see a call out for cardiovascular mortality anymore based on, it seems like one objection today. I think from a public health standpoint, there's a big difference between saying there's cardiovascular disease that's causal and saying there's mortality. And I think that's a really important distinction that we need to underline.
Yeah, and Mark, maybe you can help us, because I thought you had backed off a little bit, particularly when we made it clear that we wouldn't be asking for any change in the cardiovascular section with respect to addressing mortality, that we would only...
Yeah, that's right. I really don't have any strong objection to having a separate causality criteria for cardiovascular mortality. I didn't think it was truly necessary, but I don't have a problem with that, as long as I do think that the cardiovascular discussion in the ISA should appropriately consider cardiovascular mortality in that section, because it has a lot to do with the causality determination for cardiovascular disease. But I have no problem with calling it out separately as its own mortality category.
Okay, so I think that's what I had understood our consensus was, that we will, in conjunction with the total non-accidental mortality, we're going to recommend also causal determination for cardiovascular mortality, which it sounds like it would be causal, and that would be there, but no change to the cardiovascular section. That's what I heard. That's what I think we agreed on.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so now I'm going to circle back to the chartered CASAC members and ask for your vote. So first up is Michelle Bell. Do you agree with, do you approve this report as a plan to be revised? And Michelle may have cycled off. If she has, I think she gave us a email approval. Jim Boylan.
Yes, I approve.
Thank you. Judy Chow.
Yes, I approve.
Thank you. Mark Frampton.
Yes, I approve.
Christina Fuller.
Yes, I approve as well.
Alexandra Panet Gonzalez.
Yes, I approve.
Okay, and I also approve. So thank you. So I think we are at the end. Does anybody need any clarity about next steps? Does everyone feel like you have clarity on that?
Leanne, do you want us to just provide written text for this for the changes, or are you going to send out a Word version of it to do track changes in, or how would you like to receive comment?
You know, I think Aaron typically sends out the Word version initially, but I'm not sure he did that for this.
It went out as PDF.
Yeah, he did not.
Okay, so
Very
Aaron,
clear. I will send that out.
Aaron will send that out because we want your effort to be as efficient as possible. So please do track changes in a Word document, and Aaron will be responsible for compiling all those. I want to also respect the fact that we put a really heavy lift on Susan Korick, who's done a yeoman's job on this whole thing with all those appendices that she was in charge of. So I particularly want to express my appreciation for all your work and all of your efforts over these past couple of days to help us get things straightened out. And B, to ask people who have provided comments on those chapters to help us and help Susan with the workload. So not to ask her to be summarizing everything that other people said, because that's just a lot of work when it's that many appendices. So if people could really step up and contribute edits and things that you suggested, really appreciate it. So lead authors plan on taking the lead, and those of you who contributed to the health sections that Susan led, please help there. And Susan, feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, I'll send stuff out to people, but I'm thinking, if it's okay, I'm gonna give some people assignments based on areas that they were particularly interested in.
Yes.
So I'll send it out to you and then ask you to fill in certain areas. So
yeah,
hopefully that'll be the most efficient.
Please do. And in terms of our emails, you know, you can email a subgroup of the panel as long as it's less than half. So, you know, free, and whoever, you can email people who were assigned or who just commented the meeting. You can choose the subgroup. Just keep Aaron and I in the loop so that we can keep track of sort of everything in a big picture way. And everybody will have a chance to weigh in on the revised report after it's edited. And feel free to reach out if you have things to either Aaron and I, or also to the lead as you see fit. Bruce.
Yes, thank you. So once we've finalized the report and the letter, I wonder if Aaron could just tell us what to expect coming down the road in the next months ahead.
So I would defer that question to EPA because they will have a better idea.
Okay.
I mean, broadly speaking, unless we will see a policy assessment at some point in the future. I'm not sure we know the time frame of that, and
okay.
I don't know if EPA wants to tell us that in public right now, but
okay.
If they do, they are more than welcome to raise their hand and let us know.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Perry?
I just wanted to make sure that before we said goodbye, that that as a group, we recognized your chairmanship of this. You've done an amazing job at pulling this together, and it's been incredibly hard work, especially the last 2 days, where I think you've really been spot on in terms of incorporating everybody's input and also just keeping track of it. So congratulations and thank you.
Well, thank you for that, but we'll see when you get the revised report whether we actually did our job or not. There's an awful lot of details here, I have to say. And I also want to thank all of you and the EPA for all of your work to get us here. It's been an enormous amount of work, and there have been many people who have stepped up in various ways, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you very, very much to everyone for your work and to EPA. And I think with that, are we ready to, I think we're ready to close. Aaron, that's your job.
Yes,
So.
thank you, everyone. We could be adjourned and we will be in touch via email on your follow-up action items. Thank you.